everyone, and by do mean everyone. There are some seats here. I feel like there's some valuable floor real estate over here, so some of you should try to find a way to make your way over here, and then you don't have to stand. Like, at least, I would say 4 or 5 people could sit here if they squish. So yeah, just kind of, I don't know, maybe even through the middle there. Anyway, my suggestion. Okay. Hi, I'm Agnes Callard. I teach in the philosophy department, and...
Hi, I'm Ben Callard. I also teach in the philosophy department.
Okay. And welcome to our first Night Owls of the year. Before we dive into this one, I just want to announce that we have some exciting Night Owls in the winter quarter. On January 31st, economist Tyler Cowen is coming to talk to us. And on February 23rd, which is a Saturday, we're having a Night Owls on the meaning of death. We're going to show Bergman's Seventh Seal, have dinner, and have a discussion. I'm going to be talking to Dan Morgan, who's the chair of Cinema and Media Studies. So that's going to be awesome. And both of those will be in a bigger room. So, in fact, all Night Owls from now on will be in a bigger room. I don't apologize to you because you're not people that got turned away, but I feel very badly about that. Okay, and one other thing, which is that before, I want to just thank a few people. I want to thank Andy, who is doing the video recording under non-ideal circumstances. Thank you. And Rory, where's Rory? Okay, Rory made the poster, which, let's face it, is why you're all here, right? Thank you, Rory, for an awesome poster. And then, finally, basically everything else is William Weaver, who he's probably out in the hallway right now helping people. But anyway, thank you to William. Okay, so here's the format for this discussion. Ben and I each have a set of questions that we're going to ask each other. We don't know what the questions are. Okay, we just came up with the questions, right? Before we start, I'm going to give Ben the job of kind of like giving some background. I'm not going to do that. I'm kind of an oversharer, so that's not a good job for me. So, Ben, background.
Thanks a lot, Agnes. Maybe before I do that, just thank you all for coming. This is an unbelievable turnout. Also, I'm sure we're violating fire codes right now, so so just be sort of respectful of, if people need to leave, let them get out. This is slightly scary and dangerous, but I think it'll work. So I was talking to my Phil Perspectives class today about the Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. So Agnes just said she's tends to be an oversharer. I tend to be an undersharer. The happy medium is no doubt somewhere in between. So yeah, what to say? So Agnes and I are divorced, which means we were once married.
Like first step in the philosophy of divorce.
Yeah. So we got to know each other in grad school at Berkeley, and then we got married in 2003. We got divorced in 2011, which is just shy of 8 years, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And so we've been divorced ever since. And so that's almost 8 years now. So we've been divorced about as long as we've been married. We were married. I think that's all I'm going to say, at least for now.
All right.
This is not a conversation about us. It's about divorce, and in particular, it's a chance for us to think philosophically about divorce. We sort of thought about doing this. We went through it, so we thought a lot about it, and but the main thing is just it's a really interesting and important topic. Needless to say, it will have touched or will touch many people in this room. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to sound ominous. And there's I don't know whether Claudia Hogg-Blake is here. Are you here? Anyway, she said to me yesterday that we don't do enough sort of applied philosophy. We don't do enough philosophy about subjects that actually bear on, our lives as we lead them. Needless to say, we are talking about human life when we do philosophy all the time, but we tend to approach it at this very, very abstract level, right? What is a mind, or what is free will, or what is courage? Sorry, I won't go on, but there's a reason why we do that. We often think that that's where we'll get the sort of fundamental answers. Maybe that's true, and maybe it isn't true. But in any event, I'm talking in a more applied way. I think it can sort of get us to see why we're doing that more abstract stuff, and sometimes it can actually just help us to see the truth about the subject in a way that we don't normally. I'll stop talking. Yeah.
One thing is, you should feel free to leave at any time too. So we'll go on for 3 hours, but if you don't want to go on for 3 hours, we won't be offended at any point. The way these go is just that people stick around for a while and leave when they feel like leaving. So that's totally fine.
We'll be offended if you leave right now. But
Also good luck leaving, but yeah. Okay, so can I ask the first question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So, about half an hour before this thing started, Ben and I were talking on the phone. He's like, I can't print my questions because printer's broken. I'll just bring my computer in and read them off my computer. And I'm like, oh no, that's a terrible idea. Sitting here with your laptop, just email them to me. I was in my office. Email them to me, I'll print them. He's like, no, it's fine. I'll just read them off my computer. I'm like, no, obviously the right thing for you to do is for you to email to me so I can print them. And as we're going back and forth on this, I'm realizing that he just cannot believe that I won't read the questions, okay? He just can't, he's just like, I'm not emailing them to you, and I can tell he's thinking, you're gonna read the questions, and I don't want you to know what the questions are. Okay, so my first question is, what is trust, and why is it important in marriage?
All right. Good. Okay, so I have to say something now. So the first thing, in the mode of confession, is I did not trust you. You're right about that. I trust you about the important things in life. I trust you about the crucial things. It's precisely about this kind of inconsequential thing where I don't trust you at all. So.
Inconsequential.
But then, and I'm sure, again, we've been reading Aristotle's Ethics. I'm sure there's somewhere in there a thing about not putting somebody in the position of having, it would have been so tempting that it would have been wrong of me to
Thank you.
Yeah. But trust, yeah. So you want to know what trust is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We really didn't. We didn't tell each other the questions ahead of time. Can I back my way into this, because that's a hard question. I mean, the first thing to say is, it's clear that trust is extremely important in a marriage. And it's important in lots of different sorts of relationships. Maybe especially important in a marriage. I mean, I take it that when you trust somebody, you're. This is something we actually did in my class in the spring. You might think that it's a belief in the other person that isn't resting on evidence. It isn't in any direct way. So it's not that, so to speak, you've got good reasons or good evidence for thinking that the person will do what they say, or that that what they're saying is that they're not deceiving you.
So you're saying trust is irrational belief?
I think it's non-rational belief.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And why is that important in a marriage?
Yeah. So it would have to do something with the non-transactional character of the the marriage relationship. So it's not when you're dealing with somebody in a way that's let's say commercial or something. You should go entirely on evidence. It seems to me. But when you're in a marriage relationship, there, in a certain sense, it isn't. I mean, this is something I want to get into a little bit later on. But what's the relationship between marriage and sort of obligations, rights, expectations, and so on? Legally, those things are center stage when it comes to defining marriage, and it's when one party at fault divorces, when you fail to meet your obligations, that's when the other party can say, okay, I get to have a divorce now. But it looks like that's the wrong way of thinking about marriage in the first place. It's not defined by a set of obligations and rights. It's sort of the wrong model to think about the nature of the relationship. Anyway, so that would be.
So you're saying trust figures in the sorts of relationships that are not governed by obligations and rights?
Yeah. That's
Okay.
the thought anyway. I don't know whether it's.
Okay, your turn.
My turn? Yeah. Okay. All right. So a comedian who I won't name, disgraced these days, made the following claim. So I'm going to quote him. Someday one of your friends is going to get divorced. It's going to happen, and they're going to say, they're going to tell you, don't say, I'm sorry. That's a stupid thing to say. First of all, you'll make them feel bad for feeling really happy, which isn't fair. And second of all, divorce is always good news. I know that sounds weird, but it's true because no good marriage has ever ended in divorce. It's really that simple. Is it really that simple? That is it possible for a good marriage to end in divorce? Or is it a criterion on the quality of the marriage that it ends in divorce?
Great question. So I think it's possible for a good marriage to end in divorce. Here's a case I'm thinking of. And maybe people used to think a lot of divorces were like this, and maybe very few of them are, but it still seems like a conceptual possibility. It could be that you're with someone and you're like pretty happy, but you have a kind of fantasy or mirage or image that you could be so much happier than you are, right? And maybe you're someone who this is like a characteristic fact about you where no matter what you're doing and no matter what you're involved in, you always think things could be a bit better. And maybe they couldn't be. That seems at least like a conceptual possibility. So it seems like there could be a case where a person essentially gets divorced on the grounds of a kind of fantasy. And like whether it was a good divorce or not depends on whether or not the people are happier after the divorce, and they could be less happy, it seems to me. So it could be that it was a bad decision. I don't have enough experience of divorces to know how often that happens, but I would tend to think that most of the time the barriers against it are high enough that wouldn't be most of the cases.
Okay. Are we allowed to answer our own questions, or do we have to wait for the other person to re-ask?
I'll allow it.
Thank you. I just thought of a case. I'm not sure this counts as that case, but I mean, suppose some nefarious people frame one of the people in the marriage. They make them look for all the world like they're a horrible person who's done all these terrible things. Couldn't the other person have a reason to divorce them, even though it was actually a good marriage? Like,
That's
like a tragic case.
Yeah. Good. So yes, there could be cases where you would have a reason to divorce them, even though it was a good marriage.
I mean, it goes a little bit to your earlier question about trust. You might think trust should handle that case, but I don't think it.
Yeah, you could sharpen the example such that it wouldn't. Yeah, good. So that would be another kind of funny case. But I think the point is basically well taken, that most of the time when people get divorced, they're kind of happy about it because, it's what they wanted, right? They did it for a reason. Okay. Can I ask my next question?
Sure.
Okay. Why is divorce so upsetting for children, and why are they prone to see themselves as the cause?
This is much harder than I thought it was going to be. I mean, the first thing to say is children's reactions to divorce vary a huge amount, I take it. And it partly depends on the nature of the divorce and partly on the nature of the kids. So there isn't a kind of single way kids react to it. But you're saying, why is it so often the case that kids
Yes.
are? Yeah. So, I mean, I take it, it can be a bunch of different reasons. So sometimes it's that they see the parents in a different light. They might think that the parents have, they cease to see them as the anchor of their, a thing that they can feel secure about. Depending on the details of the case, it might be some specific worry that they have about one or both of the parents. And then there's I take it the feeling that they're at fault is not a small part of the story of why they're so upset. And now your question was, why do they feel that way so often?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know is the short answer.
Well, maybe we should.
Yeah.
Maybe we should hold off on that one because I bet there's going to be questions. We're going to do like a couple back and forths, and then we'll have like questions from you guys, and then we'll do more back and forths. And probably a number of you are children of divorce, so maybe you want to answer this question. So maybe we should leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah.
Or is there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, again, there are I think there could be lots of reasons, but I take it that, and again, it depends on so many things, the age of the kid, right? But quite often it's that there's a kind of earthquake quality to it. It's that there were some things that they were taking as firm or fixed, and those things are called into question or disrupted, and so it's a kind of loss of balance or a loss of a sense of.
I think that's
what
a
they
really
are.
good point, that there can be things where we presuppose them and everything seems to rest on them and we don't even notice that we've presupposed them, like that the sun's going to rise or something, right? And then if that thing is taken away, it could be super destabilizing even if you never, like you can't quite articulate why. So it could be that there's this presupposition that sort of the children are making. Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
Should I go?
Yeah.
I was asking before, can a good marriage end in divorce? There's a prior question, which is, can a marriage end in divorce? Are divorces possible metaphysically? And there's, right? And there's, I know very little about the Roman Catholic doctrine that's relevant here, but my sense is that's the doctrine. The doctrine is that you can nullify a marriage, right? You can get I looked it up, what's it called? A Declaration of Nullity, which is in effect a declaration that there never was a marriage in the first place. But you can't, if you have an actual marriage, and dissolve it or end it. It's impossible. Not that it's wrong, it's impossible. You can't do it. I don't want to get into the sort of the specifics of the metaphysics of Catholic doctrine, but I guess my question for you was, can you see anything in that idea, the idea that once you've made a commitment of the kind that you make when you get married, that you sort of can't unmake it or can't get out of it? Can you see reasons for accepting that don't rest on any particular, theological or other reasons, but just a sort of reason that everybody in the room might be able to share? Is there anything to that idea? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the kind of state, if someone says, I now pronounce you man and wife, right? That's a speech act of a certain kind where now you are in like a new category, like, and it's been made to happen by its being spoken, right? And so they made it true that you're married, the person who said that, let's say. But it's not clear why someone can't just then also make it true that you're not married by another speech act, right? Like you could have a speech act that declares this is money, right? And now it's money and we can use it. Well, until we decide that that kind of currency isn't valid anymore. If we decide no more pennies or something, well, then that's not money anymore. So it's hard to see how, like, once you admit the sort of metaphysical magic trick of making something happen by declaring it to be the case, why you can't just undeclare it to be the case. But one grounds that I could see for that, but it would only be specific to something like opposition to no-fault divorce, would be, say you think that when you get married, you make a promise to stay married to the person, right? You do, basically. You assert vows, right, which are promises. In order to not be married anymore, you would have to not be bound by that promise, right? Okay. And so divorce requires like being released from the promise. But a no-fault divorce, that says that, like, say I just want to get divorced and Ben doesn't, right? Then we can get divorced. That's what no-fault divorce is, right? That is, one party can initiate the divorce proceedings. But if Ben wants to stay married and say, I want to be divorced, well then, in effect, I've made this promise to Ben, and he hasn't released me from the promise, right? And so I'm still bound by that promise. And so you could think that really the only way out of marriage would be mutual release from promises, but that requires a kind of divorce where both people agree to release one another from the promises, and otherwise you're still bound by that promise, whether you say it or acknowledge it or not. So that would be like one case one could make. I was thinking of it as like a case against no-fault divorce, right? A kind of metaphysical case against it, effectively, because you're still bound no matter what. You still promised, right? Someone can say, oh, I don't call you married anymore, but you still promised. But I don't know, like, yeah, so.
But so there are two cases. There's the question, can you unilaterally release yourself from a promise? And there's the question, can somebody else release you from their promise?
Good.
And you might think the answer to the second question is obviously yes, but I'm not sure it's obviously yes.
Okay, I was presupposing that the person to whom you make a promise can release you from the promise. And I was also presupposing that you cannot release yourself from a promise. But you disagree with either of those?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about it. Can I, in a way it's a follow-up question, but you've written about a kind of puzzle about anger. The puzzle is, how can you cease having reasons to be angry? If you have a reason to be angry at somebody, they stole your bike, how can anything give you a reason to stop being angry, since the fact that they stole your bike is just sitting there in the past? That's not going anywhere, right?
Right.
So, I mean, it was sort of in the neighborhood of that thought. The thought is, so to speak, your promise is just sitting there. Now, you sketched, you said, look, given that these are, there's the magic of performatives, but your thought is, however we understand that magic, if you can do it once, you can do it twice.
Yeah.
But in any event, that was the worry, or the question is, so to speak, how do you get rid of a promise once you've made it? It's sort of sitting there. You still promised, right? And it's that sort of worry.
Yeah, I guess I would distinguish the claim that it's still true that you promised in the past from the claim that it's still true that you're normatively bound by that promise in the present.
Okay, yeah, good.
Okay.
I think
How about you ask, wait, was that?
That was mine.
That was yours,
yeah.
okay. How about I'll ask you another question, and then we'll have some questions from you guys, and then we'll ask more questions? Okay. Okay. It's really hard to decide. What's good about being married?
So I take it there's sort of accidental goods and per se good, or essential goods. So I think even in a bad marriage, there can be good things, right? So I take it that you meant sort of what's good. Was the thought what's good per se about marriage, or what is good about a good marriage, or?
I mean, I was thinking of it this way. Like, a lot of people in this room are probably thinking, like, someday I might get married, right? And so I want you to tell them, like, why they might. Like, what's good about being married such that they'll have those goods if they get married.
Yeah, okay. Right. I mean, again, in a way, the problem is that there can be good things even in a bad marriage and a marriage you shouldn't be in. So it's some of the things that I would say to answer your question would be things which I wouldn't be saying by way of recommending getting married.
Good. So what are the good things about marriage that also constitute reasons to get married?
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, in a certain way, this is related to a question that we should have started with, but we didn't, which is sort of, what is a marriage? Like, what are we talking about
I know.
here?
That was on my list.
Yeah, it was on my list too. Socrates would be ashamed of us. We should start with that. And I take it can we maybe start there and maybe we'll get an answer
ask that one
out
first.
of that.
Sure. Yeah.
So I mean, but that's itself a really hard question. I think there are maybe a couple of ways to try to get an answer, but it's not clear you get a good answer from either of these. So one would be to try to think of a paradigm case or a kind of canonical example of a marriage, and then try to read what a marriage is off of the paradigm case. The other way would be just to look at a whole bunch of things that are pretty clearly marriage and try to find something common to all of them. I think the first approach will tend to be too narrow. It'll tend to rule out things that are marriage, and the second one will tend to be too open. It'll tend to rule in things that aren't marriage. For example, we don't want. I take it we don't want to say that marriage is just like two people agreeing to live their lives together. That's too broad, right? That could be a friendship. It could be a business partnership, right? So we got to add something. But now, what do we add that doesn't then start ruling out things that clearly are marriage, right? Do we want to add, the prospect of sex? Do we want to add the possibility of children? Do we want to add? What do we want to add to? What's the differentia? Clearly, a marriage does involve two people spending their lives together, but it's not just that. We need something else. Obviously, the modern answer is love. Or at least that's the ideal. But we don't want to include love in the definition of marriage. I think that's not. That would rule out lots and lots of marriages. That is, we want bad marriages to be marriages too,
Right.
And we also want old-fashioned traditional marriages to be marriage, where love maybe was less of a defining feature. So, anyway, all this is to say, I'm not quite sure what marriage is.
Let alone what's good about it.
Right, yeah. The reason it's related to your question is, I'm not sure there's anything good about marriage per se once we get the broad enough conception of it.
Okay.
There are some wonderful things about a good marriage, but can you try to answer the
question of what is a marriage?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it is a romantic union bound by commitment. I just made that up right now. So, and so I say romantic. That's supposed to cover broader than love, a little bit broader than love, but be in the love family, and to suggest sex. And to exclude the workplace relationship and the partnership and all that. Business partner. What's good about that? I guess I would say a certain form of cooperation, like a certain kind of working together. That is the best thing about marriage. You know how, I don't know, in say elementary school, or less so in university, but in high school, there will always be that point where the teacher tries to make you do a group project, and with the idea that it's gonna somehow be better if you do a group project, and my kids are always really annoyed by this, by sort of, I don't want to work with other people. And it's sort of like marriage is I would feel like marriage is the context where that thing works. It actually is better that you're doing it with someone else, and you couldn't live better on your own. It's like the ideal group project. That's what I would say is good about marriage. Okay, I think we should open up for a few questions, and then we'll ask each other more questions. Yeah.
What do you think would be a good reason, or what would be good parts of not allowing divorce? So if you get married, that's it, you're done.
Right, good reasons not to allow divorce. Do you want to start, Ben?
Yeah. So we already saw that there are some traditions on which it's not a matter of not allowing it. It's not possible whether they wanted to allow it or not, right? It's metaphysically impossible. I take it most religious traditions don't have that view, but some do. But so your question is, Sorry, can you just maybe say a little bit more about where
you talked about the Catholic idea.
Yeah.
But let's say I think you could make good arguments for why you should have divorce, but why would you make an argument for why you shouldn't? Why would you say, if you would at all, that once you've decided to get married and thought about it pretty hard, that's it. Like, you're in it, and whatever problems you have, just work it out.
Yeah.
Would that ever end up well?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my own 2 cents on that is I can't think of any good reasons. There are certainly lots of reasons accidentally why it might be good in a particular case not to, but you're talking about sort of a general policy. And there, I guess I can't see reasons that would support a general policy. I mean, can you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, like, you might think, well, we actually have these norms with other relationships, not with marriage, and it's can from a certain point of view seem kind of arbitrary. We think that about your kids, right? You're not allowed to be like, I'm tired of you, like, right? I mean, there is this thing of disowning, but like, it's just heavily normatively sanctioned, right? And like, basically, if you have kids, you keep, you don't get tired of them when they're 5 or something and get rid of them, right? So like, you're supposed to, you make a commitment to them, and there's not really any way of divorcing from them, right? So you might just think like, wait, why don't we do that with more relationships, right? Like, why don't we do it with romantic relationships? That is, and in a way, right, it's kind of an interesting fact about the way we think about romantic relationships, that we think of it, the norms work serially, right? Like, so like serial monogamy is seen as fine, right? Like, you have one romantic relationship, you break up, you have another romantic relationship, you break up, right? Whereas like multiple partners at one time, like and I have questions about that, but for later, that's somewhat sanctioned, like against, right? With kids, it goes the other way, right? You have multiple kids, you don't get rid of your kid when you have a new kid, right? They worry about that, but you don't do that. You do it with marriages, right? But you don't do it with kids, right? It's interesting, isn't it? Like that we have these norms that are so divided in this way. So it would be like, I think that if you somehow saw the marriage relationship as more like the, having more of the structure of the parent-child relationship, then maybe you could have that, but then maybe you would also be inclined to favor like allowing multiple partners, and just like how we allow multiple children, right? So I guess my feeling is that the permissibility of divorce and the impermissibility of multiple spouses are like connected.
But I would have thought there were relevant differences between the kid case and the grown-up case. In the kid case, first of all, they're dependent on you in a pretty strong sense, and in the second, on the second front, they can't consent. It's not a consensual relationship, right? They didn't ask to get born, as they like to remind us. They did not. So I would have thought that the reason that there's an asymmetry there, that there are reasons having to do with the relationship between parents and children and the nature of children that make getting rid of, opting out of that impermissible, that don't apply in the case of marriage.
It's true, but it's not like we do it with our children when they get old enough. Like, we don't ever divorce them, right? So even when they're independent.
That's true, but I'm not sure it would be wrong to.
Okay, but it would be very weird.
I think the violinist Jascha Heifetz divorced his kids. He just said, "I don't like you people," and he just.
But that's seen as like not okay, right?
It is
so
seen
whereas like divorcing your spouse, it's like broadly okay. I mean, you pick the next question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
What is a bad marriage from your definition, or after your definition? Can you have a bad marriage?
Oh yeah. So I mean, I take it can be bad for all kinds of reasons. So we were talking before about the definition of marriage, and I didn't want to include love in the definition because we could certainly use the word marriage that way, or we could either use it as part of the definition, or we could at least use it, in the statement of the ideal. But in any event, I do want to include it in the ideal, and so I take it the paradigm case of a bad marriage is a marriage where the people don't love each other, and that's. But there are lots of ways to have a bad marriage. I take it. You want to?
Yeah, I guess I would say, just going along, what I was saying about what's good about marriage is a bad marriage is one where, in one way or another, people can't work together. I mean, so if I think about like what makes a marriage good, which isn't the same thing as what's good about marriage, right? So like we were answering earlier, what's good about marriage. I think that there are sort of like arenas of working together that are particularly important. For me, I would say conversation, sex, child raising, financial stuff, like being able to work together financially. Like apparently like some huge number of fights are about money, right? So financial stuff, basic like bodily needs like eating and sleep. Those are like, people can be food and sleep incompatible. And that it's kind of important when you're like, a lot of your day is spent asleep, right? So if you sleep in really different ways, that could be a problem. So these are like arenas of working together, right? And they can work or not. And I guess what a good marriage is when like each of those forms of working together work. That's what I would say. And so a bad marriage would be like too big of a failure on too many of those fronts.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I looked up how you can get a declaration of nullity in the Catholic tradition, and mostly it has to do, so what you have to show is, roughly speaking, that there wasn't a marriage to begin with. But then there are lots of ways to show that, and many of them have to do with the terms of the marriage, the initial terms having been having been misleading or something like that. So I wrote them down. Deliberate deceit about some personal quality that can objectively and gravely perturb conjugal life, for example. That, right? And that, so Agnes's point about certain kinds of compatibility, one question you could ask is, which of those forms of incompatibility might you deliberately cover up in such a way that you could then get a declaration of nullity later on in terms of it? And that opens out onto a much larger question about, which is interesting quite apart from the issue of marriage, about the role of knowledge and consent, right? So there, the part of consent that gets focused on the most is, if somebody does something forcibly, that's the kind that we tend to think most about. But there is another kind of consent violation where it's, and there are names for this, I'm forgetting what it is, but you can violate somebody's consent via deceit rather than via force. And again, I take it that's in the neighborhood of the thought here. It's that you might, so to speak, have had a fraudulent marriage by virtue of misrepresenting these facts about yourself in such a way that the marriage doesn't work. And they would have, if they had known that, they wouldn't have gotten married. I don't know who was next in terms
My
of.
turn.
Yeah, okay.
Eva.
Backing up to the idea of a good marriage involving working together, how do you understand then a marriage where the partners are, through external circumstances, forced to be like physically separate? For example, living in different countries. Do they then essentially have a bad marriage?
That's a great question. I think that often they do. But I think not necessarily because of facts about the world we live in that allow people who are far apart from one another to work together, like phones and Skype and email. It's hard to imagine that such people could have had a good marriage, like before any of those things, like even letters, with the amount of time it takes, like that it would just be like living most of your life by yourself, right? Not living with the other person. But I think that I guess I think that we have ways of working together at a distance now. There's just a question of like how good are they, and like how many of the things on my list can you do together when you're physically apart, right? And a number of them you can't. So then the issue is like how often can they see one another, right? And then, like, I don't know if any of you have ever been in like a long distance relationship, but one thing that's kind of weird about them is that then when you see the person, it becomes this sort of very intense thing where you have to like be together every minute and make every minute count. And that's also like a weird way of living with someone. Like that's not the normal way, right? So that's a kind of additional, I would say something like pitfall or something of the long distance thing is even that when you see each other, that form of being together is not the natural or normal form of being together. But, so I would say it's like a lot harder for it to work.
So it seems empirically that there's harm done to kids by divorce. Do you take that to be a contingent, socially constructed fact about how we view parenthood? Or is it a necessary, essential feature? And if it is necessary and essential, does that change how we should legislate divorce?
Great question. Yeah. I mean, I remember, the main thought going through my head when we decided to get divorced was, we are harming our children. And I firmly believe that. And I was like, I need to be aware that I'm agreeing to this with the knowledge that I'm doing that. It actually turned out to be less harm than I thought it would be. But that's not to say that I had the belief that it would be less. I had the belief that it would be more. The thing that I've sort of realized is you harm your children all the time. Kind of constantly. And so then the question is sort of how great of a harm is it? And how much does that, how much of a consideration is that given other harms that you could be doing by not getting divorced, right? To yourself, even say, right? That is, I don't believe that children's needs always trump. So, which is to say, the fact that the children are being harmed doesn't automatically, it's a consideration, but it doesn't automatically count against divorce, right? But you asked about legislation specifically. And I take that to be a question at the political level about what kinds of laws we should have about divorces. Or was it not?
Well, I'm just more interested if you think that it's in virtue of a socially constructed fact of how we view one man and one woman and how kids are raised. Or is it, even without these social constructions around marriage, there is some essential harm being done to kids when they're not raised in this kind of household, if that makes sense.
So I definitely don't think that it's necessarily a harm to a kid to not be raised in a traditional household. But divorce is a different thing because it's the breaking of that, right? And so that could be a harm to a kid, even if the kid would have been maybe perfectly happy just to be raised by the one parent, and right? But the question is I guess I think that however marriage would be, I can imagine marriage being understood in a variety of ways, and it has changed over our lifetimes, right? When we were young, we never thought that there would be gay marriage, and now there is, and that's a change in our norms about marriage, right? I can imagine it changing in a variety of ways, but I guess I can't imagine it changing so much that there wouldn't be some things that could happen that would be harms to kids, if you see what I mean. That is, there's gonna have to be some kind of expectation, and then that can be broken. And it's something about, I do think Ben was right earlier when he said it's something about there are these very deep assumptions that kids make when they sort of come into the world, and they just they make these assumptions where they're so deep you can't really articulate them. At first they kind of assume they're the only person or something, and it's traumatic for them to learn that there are sort of other important beings. And it's they're just assuming that there's a certain world, and then if you break that world, that's going to be upsetting for them. But of course, what counts as breaking it is going to be socially constructed, right? But could there be, in some sense, could there be a world without some social construction or other? It's probably not. And then however you broke that would be traumatic for the kid, is my thought.
Right, but it does seem whether your parents staying together are one of these sort of grounding background assumptions of kids is going to be at least largely socially constructed. That is, if you're in an environment where, even as a kid, that lots and lots of your friends parents are getting divorced and stuff, that will affect how you react psychologically when your own do. It may not eliminate the response, the being upset, but it'll certainly affect it. But sorry, just to answer sort of your I take it your thought was like, is there, in a way, there's two questions here. One is about whether it's socially constructed or not, or to what extent it's socially constructed, and the other is just whether it's a construction or not. Is there like a per se problem? Like, are all children traumatized by divorce? I take it the answer to that question is no. It does depend on the circumstances. It's common that they are, but it's not. I take it isn't necessary, even given our mores and the way we've constructed it. It's typical, but not necessary. I think. Do you want to?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I have a question about promise. You mentioned, like, you guys analyze how promise works as the mechanism of promise, but isn't promise like when a man says to a woman that I will stay with you forever in my life? Isn't he just describing his mental state at the moment? In this sense, like, promise is just a description to a kind of feeling. So, like, for example, like 10 years after, when a man no longer feel bounded by the promise, that the promise just automatically dissolved. So how would you respond to this idea?
So I don't think that a promise is just a description of your psychological state, right? It's a commitment. Whether you ought to make such a commitment, given that is a different question. And one of the standing problems with the ethics of promise making is that it looks like very often the conditions on keeping the promise are not entirely under your control. As it were, it partly has to do with your will and what you decide, but it very often anyway, I take it almost always, extends beyond your will, and the world has to play ball in order for you to keep your promise. That fact, you might think, makes promise making an ethically hazardous and therefore an ethically problematic thing to do. Everybody in this room has made promises. There's a question: should you make promises given this fact? But in any case, I don't think it's just when you say I promise to do this, you're not just saying something about how you're currently feeling. I take it you're bonding yourself. You're committing yourself to future actions. It's a normative structure once you say it.
I would say there's a difference between promises and predictions. So it sort of sounded like the thing you said was a prediction.
Or I took it you thought it's just I feel like doing something right now.
I feel like I want to be with you for the rest of my life.
Right, but you're just saying right now I feel that way. Yeah.
Yeah, in the back there. Yeah, you. Mm-hmm.
So when you were talking about the metaphysics of making promises of a marriage, do you think there's any way to move into that sort of like a clause which says that this is a promise which holds metaphysically until and unless one party in this contract decides that this is no longer good for them, and that is part of the promise. So like not being bound forever just by virtue of saying it at that time, but with the ability that if it is sort of broken in one person's mind, that's okay. Is that possible?
Great question. So the thought is like, could you structure the promise so that you write into it that it's going to be one where no fault divorce will apply, essentially, right? I think you can, because it's sort of like, you might wonder whether that's a promise, right? So let's say Ben and I say, let's agree we're going to play tennis on Tuesday, unless either one of us doesn't feel like it, right? And then it's like, have we promised or committed to play tennis on Tuesday? Right? You might think we haven't actually committed to anything there, because what we've said is whether or not we'll do something depends on whether or not we feel like it, right? And that's exactly to not promise. So that it's a good example because it sort of shows, it shows the difficulty of legitimating no-fault divorce, right? Because it sort of shows that if we try to legitimate it by building it into the promise, we actually turn a promise into a non-promise. That's a cool point. Did you want to say something?
No, it's good.
Okay. Yeah, in the back there. Sorry.
Yeah.
This one.
So I don't mean this to be sensational. I think this is in the vein of defining marriage.
Mm-hmm.
But to what degree did you, when you were dating or fear the condition of only being able to have sex with one person for the rest of your life? And then how big of a factor was that when you were considering divorce?
Good. Well, can I actually, hold on. I actually want to read you something, okay? This was going to be one of my questions, but, so this is from American Sociological Review 2015. It is difficult to think of any other legal practice of which more people disapprove than infidelity. Legal meaning it's not illegal. According to a recent poll, 91% of US adults consider extramarital infidelity to be morally wrong, a higher percentage than object to suicide, polygamy, or human cloning. The overwhelming, weird group, isn't it? The overwhelming majority of married persons expect their spouse to have sex only in marriage and assume their spouse expects the same. There's a bunch of research cited here that I'm not reading you. Yet, infidelity is relatively common. Due to social desirability and impression management concerns, precise estimates are hard to come by. However, researchers estimate that in the United States, between 20 and 25% of married men and between 10 and 15% of married women have engaged in extramarital sex. The incongruity between our attitudes, expectations, and behaviors suggests that there are socio-structural factors that promote infidelity. Interesting, right? Promote infidelity. Okay, so the sort of bigger question to step back is why, what's so bad about infidelity first, right? And you might say, well, infidelity is bad because it's a form of lying or cheating or deception, right? Fine, but then, why is the idea of having sex with only that person tied to the idea of marriage, right? We could put it that way. That is, infidelity involves cheating because there are these expectations that people have that they then get one another to agree to, right? So then it becomes a case that you can only have sex outside marriage if you violate those agreements. But you could have different agreements. Why don't people have those agreements, right? So what is the sort of what is both the appeal and maybe the lack of appeal of committing to only have sex with one person for the rest of your life, right? Clearly, what this passage shows us is that idea has great appeal for us, as a country, but then also the violation of that idea has great appeal for us. So we're really conflicted about how we feel about whether we want to commit ourselves to having sex with only one person. I'm going to make you answer this, Ben, because it was one of my questions.
Oh.
Well, I'll try and answer it too, but I'm going to pass to you first. So why do you think that marriage is connected with a kind of with sexual exclusivity?
Yeah. So I mean, you can give, there's sort of different kinds of answer you can give to that, and the question is which is the most illuminating kind of answer, right? So you could give an answer, you can give sort of evolutionary answers to that question, or sociological answers.
I want a rational answer. Is there any good reason?
Yeah. So you might think that it's entailed by love, romantic love, that you will only be interested in having sex with that person. And if you take love as essential to a good marriage, or at least to the ideal marriage, you might just draw it out of that. But I take it that premise might be
good. So if we tie love, marriage, and sex all together, right? And then we think we need some more premises, you can only be in love with one person at a time, right? So if we somehow think you can only be in love with one person at a time, and love and sex are essentially tied, then that would underwrite one side of this, the anti-infidelity side. We still need to explain the other side, why people still cheat, right? They clearly some of those premises are not working for people, right? I mean, it's pretty clear that people have sex with people for all sorts of reasons, right? And not only because they're in love with them, and not only because they want to spend their lives with them, right? On the other hand, there is still a kind of tie, right? A kind of thought that sexual intimacy has like a kind of natural home in a committed relationship. And maybe part of that has to do with trust, right? That that at least for a lot of people, they're like the trust would be the like because you might wonder like, you know, even if love and marriage are both love is tied to sexuality and sexuality and then love is also tied to marriage. Yeah, I guess why think of the tie as being so tight when clearly it can also break, at least the love and sexuality one. And so I guess what I would think is like something that pulls it back. Like people's sexual desires clearly do somewhat extend beyond love, right? But what might pull them back, the kind of gravitational force that might pull it back towards monogamy might have something to do with trust.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to
Yeah.
you? Yeah, I don't feel like we've really fully answered
Yeah.
this question, but I have more questions along these lines, so I'm hoping we'll get back to it. I think it's a really deep one. Carolyn.
So I feel like there are kind of two accounts of what a good relationship requires. One is like, oh, people in a good relationship, like you have to put in the effort. You know, like a good relationship is hard work. And on the other end, you also hear people saying like, oh, when you find love, like it's easy. Love should feel easy and you shouldn't have to put in a lot of effort. So I guess like, does a good marriage require work, or should you seek a good marriage that feels effortless?
Good question. I mean, you might want to distinguish two kinds of hard work or something, right? Sorry, one question is, are they phenomenologically distinguishable from the first, right? Right. But you might think that there's a kind of work or effort that is part of a good relationship, but there's another kind that isn't, where, so to speak, if you're having to work in that way, it's not a good relationship. I think that's probably true, but then there's the question: so how do you tell which is which? I'm not sure there is a kind of a nice test or a nice mark of the two. So I'm still thinking. Go ahead.
I have a friend who says like the key to a good marriage is errands, running errands together. And I think his thought is that that's like this sort of perfect balance between something where you are putting some effort into it, in that like you're going to Costco or whatever together, doing shopping. Like it isn't just all like fun because you're like doing work, but you kind of like are hanging out while you're doing like that. A lot of life involves doing stuff that you don't feel like doing that much. And like part of what a marriage can give you is someone to do that stuff with, so that the stuff doesn't seem as bad. Like the errands have to be done one way or the other, but you can do them with someone. So that would be like a way of saying that marriage makes some of the harder things easier. But I guess I just do think that, I think when you're choosing your marriage, you want it to be as easy as possible, but then once you've chosen, you want to be willing to work through the difficult stuff. And how you do that, like how you deal with the difficult stuff, I think is maybe my list of like what makes a good marriage. I realize I left out maybe the most important thing on the list that you have to be able to do well with the other person, which is fighting. I think fighting well is a really important virtue of a marriage, right? And that's hard, right? It's sort of like we're all inclined when we fight with people to just become our worst selves and to like be vindictive and to interpret them as uncharitably as possible. And if you find someone where you can fight with them, but like at every moment they're just trying to say the truth about you, and they're not trying to get back at you or get revenge on you, and they're seeing any terms of moral criticism as like being really serious tools that they shouldn't abuse or try to exploit, like you're such a jerk or something. Like they wouldn't just say that. They would only say it if you were really being a jerk.
I feel like that's probably like number one thing. If I had to, like, number one on my list of like, and that's like something difficult, right? Fighting is difficult, but if you can do that with someone well and stay serious throughout the fight, that's kind of like excellence in marriage from my point of view.
I agree with that, but I'm inclined to be a kind of pluralist about good fighting, in a way. I was just reading about Dylan Thomas, the poet, and his wife, Caitlin, and they had fights that did not fit this description. But I'm not even sure it was a good marriage. Maybe it was a bad marriage, and maybe it was a bad marriage for this reason. But it was a different model. It was sort of like they just went at each other and just said horrible things and screamed at each other, and then they had makeup sex, and it was a very tempestuous sort of high energy sort of a relationship. So I think there might be just different. I mean, would you just say that's just a bad marriage, or like?
I mean, it's not for me.
Yeah.
But. I guess I think maybe it's not necessarily a bad marriage, but I do think it's a bad way to fight. Because I think that fighting actually offers you the opportunity, especially fighting with your spouse, offers you the opportunity to learn something and become a better person if you do it well. And they're not doing it in that way. And they might be doing it to let off steam or whatever, or to deal with the fact that they have incompatibilities. And like that's, maybe that's like a release valve on their marriage and it still works out overall. But I guess I would describe it as non-ideal marriage fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to return to the discussion on promises and kind of the metaphysics of marriage, because I think a lot of it depends on a certain account of personal identity and the implications that personal identity has on what we should do. So I kind of just run around this through like a transportation case. So I'm going to give two cases. So say person A is married to person B, and then person B steps into a room and then it scans each part of person B, destroying it, and then sends it over to Mars. Now, would person A be married to person B? And if yes, what if there is like an exact replica and person B isn't destroyed? Would person A be married to both of those people? So that's kind of what I'm
Trying to see. This is Ben's kind of question. He's been waiting for someone to ask this question.
No, I haven't. Yeah. I mean, you're asking the question, so I take it you understand that the question, forget marriage for a second, the question, is the person who steps out identical to the person who stepped in? That's a fraught, contentious question. People disagree a lot about it. We can certainly agree that, so to speak, with the conditional, if it's the person who steps out, then they're married, and then we have split cases, what to do about those. I guess I don't think that there's anything. Those are just hard questions, and I'm not sure there's a kind of nice answer to those questions quite apart from the relationship part of the story. That is, should we say these are both identical to the original person? Should we say that neither of them is? That leaves us with a sort of, well, first of all, a practical question. You're this person's spouse. Now you're confronted with, first of all, a person who went to Mars. We have to ask whether they survived that. And then second of all, suppose you have two type identical people. Are these both your spouse or what? There's a sort of practical question there. There's also an ethical question in the following sense. We can ask, what are the reasons to love somebody? And if the reasons have to do with the kinds of properties that both of these people have by virtue of being type identical, then, so to speak, you ought to love both of them. That's not to say you are married to both of them. It's to say that, so to speak, you have the same kinds of reasons. Or you might add to that, a causal history condition, and then we're just back in the problem of identity across time. We have to say, so which of these satisfies that condition? That's just that's our question. But yeah, go ahead.
Can I just, do you think the answers to these questions affect, the answers to the previous questions, like on promises and the metaphysics? Do you think these two issues are connected in any way, and that we can't have answers to one without tying our substances together?
Can I say a way that I think they are connected? So
it's like if I make a promise to stay married to someone, all sorts of things could happen to that person that would not affect my promise. Like they could lose an arm or become sick or become disabled, that I would still have promised to stay with them, right? And now just imagine that, like, instead of using your example, I'm going to slightly change it. Just imagine that people could undergo mitosis, right? Where it's like they could just split into two people. That's like a thing. It was super rare, almost never happens, right? But like, so it turns out that, that's what happened to your spouse, right? And then this question is like, well, does that fall under like being injured or acquiring a disability or something like that, such that, well, you did promise, so now you have promised to two people effectively, right? Or is there something in the promise where it's like implicitly, I promise to stay with you, singular? And I guess that I would be inclined to think that there isn't. That number isn't written into the promise. And so in the very weird possible world in which people could split in that way, like, I mean, it might be indeterminate whether or not you've promised. If it were known, then of course that would start to be written into marriage contracts. But it could be that, yes, you're now like married to two people and you could divorce one of them, right? Or both of them. But I guess I would think that's the way in which it is relevant to the question of promises. Adam.
So you both talked a little bit about like good marriages and like bad marriages, but I think usually when people get married, they're not thinking like I'm entering into a bad marriage.
Right.
So there seems to be some sort of deterioration of the marriage, and I'm kind of curious as to why you think this happens. Like when people get married, they're sort of, things are usually pretty good, I would hope, and even just sort of like in relationships in general, like a lot of times they start out when they're really good, everything's great, and that can last for like a really long time, but then something happens along the way that ends up, with divorce. So what do you sort of think that is, and does that have sort of any philosophical implications as to maybe the nature of love or something?
Good. Was it you who was telling me the statistic about like apparently people get divorced like not that much years 1 to 5, and then like a lot between like 5 and like 12 or something.
Yeah.
And then not that much after that. So there's actually kind of a period, right? It has a kind of pattern.
Almost nobody gets divorced in the first 5 years. It's like close to zero. You can stick it out for 5 years no matter what's going on.
Yeah. But like, let me, instead of answering your question, let me make it like a little worse. So here's another question along these lines that I was asking myself. Like a lot of people don't get divorced, right? So a lot of people stay married maybe 50 years. But is it that they don't get divorced, or is it that they didn't live long enough to get divorced, right? Because like if they lived another 100 years or something, right? Like would they have eventually gotten divorced? Or is it just that some divorces don't have time to happen because of the like shortness of the human lifespan, right? Now the pattern that we suggests like maybe that's not true, because like maybe there's like a period, and if you get beyond that point, then you're good. Okay, so I just made the question worse. So Ben.
Yeah. I mean, there's the case of deterioration. We have to say what that would be exactly, and then I take it there are cases where that would be the wrong way of thinking about it. It's not that it deteriorates. I mean, sorry, we could also call the following case that, but it would be more like a case of realizing that it was the wrong thing to begin with. So it's I don't know what to call that, disillusionment or something. So it wouldn't be that it gets worse. It's that you start to see that it was never good to begin with. And I think both of those things can happen.
Why does it take 5 years to start to see that though?
Yeah.
Like that's amazing that it would take you that long to see that.
Yeah. But I'm still trying to think about. So I'm trying to think about a case of deterioration that isn't the other case. I mean, I take it. If an event occurs, one person cheats on the other, that would be a case maybe where. So it's not. Now, of course, you might also say it turns out that that's not the person that I thought they were to begin with. So you might bring it under the heading of disillusionment rather than deterioration, even in that case. But do you think that once we make that distinction, are there cases as it were of pure deterioration as opposed to coming to see that this wasn't the right person. It's not that this was the right person initially and now they're not the right person. It's that they were never the right person.
I mean, I think I may be a little too inexperienced. But it definitely seems conceptually, I could think of like relationships that you're talking about that sort of, you know, the two people are compatible to get along, right? All the sort of arenas, everything's working well, and then just as time goes on.
Yeah. I definitely think that's possible. I also think there's a lot of psychological pressure to rewrite those cases as cases where we were never meant to be. Because then it's like, oh, we didn't do anything wrong and we didn't like screw this up. It's just like we made a mistake. You know, that is, our mistake was all at the front end. It wasn't in how we conducted ourselves, right? And I think that's a reading we prefer often. So we should be suspicious of its being universally applicable. I think that like there is some of people ceasing to try. Like, so if you just think about like dating and like what it's like at the very beginning, right? So don't think about marriage. Just think about like, you know, like the first like few weeks of dating, like you're really nice to each other and you like accommodate the other person. Like I remember my high school boyfriend, my first boyfriend, he would only eat at this one restaurant, this Italian restaurant that he just had this idea that it was his restaurant. That's the only restaurant he would go to. And we dated, like the first few months that we dated, we just went to this restaurant. That was fine. By like a year into this relationship, I was like driven insane with rage at the prospect of going to this restaurant. I remember one time I said I'll only go if I can order everything on the menu. And he's like, okay. And I ordered everything. And it was actually horrible and like really embarrassing because we did all this food and we couldn't eat it. And the whole thing was a total disaster. But anyway, like that was a thing where at first I was like happy to accommodate him, right? And so I guess like, we're friends now. You know, there's a thing where I guess where maybe it's like something in between discovering that it wouldn't. It's like there's things where you actually can't know how much it would annoy you. Like there may be no determinate fact yet, right? Like if you'd asked me when I started, like, are you going to be driven insane with rage by the prospect of going to this Italian restaurant over and over again? I would have been like, no, what's the big deal? Like, there were tons of dishes on the menu, right? Lots of stuff for me to try, right? But, like, enough time of, like, trying all those things, and, like, somehow it became, like, a symbol, right? And it acquired this kind of meaning that I couldn't have predicted that it would acquire. And I think those transformations are like a huge part of what happens over marriage, is that things acquire like symbolic meaning. And you can, I do feel like people have some agency over that. But also they have like, you know, there is something at the beginning of a relationship where you sort of feel like anything is possible. It's like the beginning of a quarter. Right? Like the beginning, like, no, but isn't it true? Like beginning of the fall quarter or something, like, you know, it's like there are all these classes you could take. They all seem amazing, right? There's this kind of sense of possibility, and I don't think it's a lie, but a sense of flexibility about who you are, too, right? And I think that it is kind of natural that like, that's part of starting something new, and then the question is just how do you navigate it? And I guess I think there is a fair amount of doing so well or badly with the person that affects how it goes, rather than it just being a question of were we fated to work out or not. Yeah. In the back. Oh no, sorry, you. Yeah.
So.
Sorry, you should call me.
I would say that like.
Yes, Sam.
So like there are aspects of people's personalities, I think, that are set, right? Versus there are other parts of somebody that may be changing over time. And so what role do you guys think personal growth takes in a marriage, and accommodation of that personal growth? And either accommodating it, at what point does it become untenable? Or how do you know whether it's something that they're growing through or whether it's something that is integral to their personality?
By the way, that point allows us the optimistic possibility of the reverse of deterioration. You start out with something that didn't seem so great, and then each person grows and grows, and it starts getting fantastic. It's much better than you realize.
Well, like 5 years, 7 to 12, and then everything beyond them. What if they grow and then they hate each other, and then they just accommodate that? So it's like spite keeps us together.
So wait, so
it's not a lie.
so what's the case is they're growing and then
they grow and then they reach a point where they're like, oh, I've dealt with the shit that this person has done for so long that I'm capable of accommodating it, and it's like, oh yeah, this person's okay, I like them, they do this annoying thing, but that's fine. Other people, and in spite against other people, not against each other. We broke up and we managed to do it. Sorry, that's really
Can I say something here's just an observation, I say this non-scientifically, but I've observed that there's a bit of a gender divide on this question. So I think that, and this is a broad generalization, but men tend to want to grow less than women want them to. So that's a source of tension in relationships, in that the men are often saying, why don't you love me for who I am? And the women are often saying, if you love me, why don't you become better, right? And it may even be that I don't know what causes this, and I'm sure there are people many people from it's not true. But it may be, for instance, that men see themselves as having a fixed nature more than women do. But in any case, right, so that's one source of tension, I think, in relationships, is that one person is expecting there to be a lot of growth, and the other person is not, right, is saying, no, you have to accept me, because there's both sort of growth and acceptance, right, and they pull against one another. You can defend men for my side.
No, I'm not defending it. But the thought you just had about how men might think, why don't you love me as I am, that wouldn't explain the asymmetry. As I take it, there's a second thought, which is men aren't expecting this of women.
Yes.
It's not just that they resist it. It's that it's asymmetric also in the expectations.
Right. Men I think want to love women for who they are, and the women want to be loved for who they could be.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
So why is that? What explains this asymmetry?
It's not exactly clear, right? So do you have a theory? I'm writing something on misogyny right now, so I'm actually really interested in this question. So, how would patriarchy explain that asymmetry?
You're making me explain a joke, but okay. I think there's a general expectation or there's a general allowance for men not having to change, and for men not having to improve themselves in any capacity while still being rewarded. In a general sense. Obviously, this is talking about broad systems, not individual people. But then with women, there's the expectation that women are always going to seek a more perfect version of themselves. A really dumb example is, so I'm transgender, and I felt a lot more permission to not wash my hair since I started living more as a man than I did as a woman. Because there's this expectation that women have to seek this ideal while men can still be taken seriously even if they haven't showered in a week.
Right, though that's specifically, so one question, right, is what kinds of norms do we hold them to, and what kinds of norms of hygiene, right, do we hold men and women to? Maybe we hold women to higher standards of hygiene than we hold men. But,
and also that men and women internalize those things, so women hold themselves and also other people, including men, to higher standards, while men maybe don't.
Right. What's partly interesting about that is that the women are who presumably are just as much informed by patriarchal thinking as the men, right? Are in fact holding the men to the higher standards, right? So it's like they didn't realize those were men, who are supposed to be happy with who they are, right? The women are no, I'm not happy with this. You need to become better. But it may, I wonder, like, I wonder if this is like how far historically going back this is true, or whether it's even true. It's true in my experience, but okay. You take some questions.
Sure. Yeah. You wanna? Yeah.
So you mentioned that there are like those elements in marriage. So can we take one element out, and is that still called a marriage? Like sex and finance, and then the rearing child together, and or if you take one element out or two elements out, that stops being called a marriage.
So my thought was that those are the arenas of cooperation, which when they go well, the marriage is going well, right? So those are the things that are good about a good marriage. Like if you ask me what makes a particular marriage good, not why one should be in a marriage, but like what are the features of a good marriage, those are the ones. But I didn't mean those to be definitional of marriage. So now on the other hand, it's sort of like if the two people didn't have sex or converse or like cooperate with respect to food or sleep, at a certain point it wouldn't be a marriage because they wouldn't be doing anything together, right? But like, you know, like child rearing is in there, and I think you can have a marriage without children. And so I definitely think you can cut things out of there. But some of them are more important than others, right? And I think like there's a lot of question, can you cut sex out? Could you have a good marriage without sex? Can you cut conversation out? Could you have a good marriage? I mean, and by conversation, I don't just mean speaking to one another occasionally, right? I mean actually having a conversation where you're devoting your attention to thinking about something together, not like, can you pass the salt or something, right? How important is that to a marriage? Like, from my point of view, extremely important, but, you know, I may have a bias here. So I guess I don't think they're all the same in that, like, I kind of, some of them are like, I can't really imagine cutting out.
It's tempting to try to find something that organizes these things together. That is such that it's not just a list, but even a list that has this kind of, this structure that Agnes was just saying, where you can take one away, but you can't take all of them away. But there's something around, something such that we can get a kind of unity or cohesion. But whether, I mean, and maybe, love is the answer to that question or something. But that I would certainly hope that we could do that. We don't just want a list of disparate things, each one of which seems like it can contribute to the thing being a marriage, and none of which is essential, but some of which are more important than others. We want some kind of...
yeah. Maybe let's hope that will emerge with further questions.
Yeah.
One question that's kind of been like, I don't know, like rolling around in my mind. So something which often happens when people get divorced is that they get remarried to another person. So I guess I was wondering how you would think about remarriage, like in the context of divorce. Like is there something fundamentally different about getting married again after having previously been married and divorced, and like how can we think about that?
I'm remarried, so I'm a good person to answer that question. I think here's one way that there's a huge difference. You feel completely free of all the wedding norms the second time around, which is awesome. That is, the second wedding feels like you can do whatever you want, whereas somehow the first wedding, it feels like, oh, there's some way that a wedding has to be. And like for a lot of people maybe, or maybe just for me, like a lot of those features were horrible. I mean, we hated our wedding. Yeah.
We basically gave it over to our families, and so it was this nightmarish.
Yeah, it was like the worst days of our lives. Yeah. We were happy to have gotten married, but not in the manner that we did. So the wedding, and my second wedding was awesome and fun. And it was because I just did what I wanted, like rather than like having my parents decide. So that's one difference. But does one? Here's a question you might have, like, well, when the first time you get married, you're just like, I'm going to be with you forever. Can you really say that the second time around? I think yes, if you're me. I mean, there's a more general, really interesting philosophical question about whether you can sort of take a non-predictive stance towards your own agency, right? So, like,
we all know that like 30 to 40% of marriages end in divorce. I think it's like lower than 50, so I think it's about right. And so like when you're getting married, can you have that in your head? It's like, there's a good chance that we'll get divorced, right? It seems like you should think that rationally, right? You should think there's a good chance we'll get divorced. But like if your spouse said that to you as your or future spouse, just about to get married, like there's a good chance we'll get divorced, you wouldn't feel okay about that, right? And like, but they're just saying a true thing, right? What's the problem with saying that true thing? And so there, it looks like, well, you need a certain kind of faith, right? Which is related to trust, kind of trust in yourself. And I think that you can have that. You might think like, well, once you've had faith in yourself and then broken it, it's hard to have it again. And I think maybe it is harder. But just like trust can be repaired even within a relationship, I think faith in yourself can be too. And so I think like you can, you can get married a second time and still have faith in yourself and still avoid the thought, there's a 30 to 40% and a higher chance if you've gotten divorced once, right? It's probably like 60% or something, right? There's a 60, I didn't have that thought, even though like on some level I probably knew that there's a, even higher chance I would get divorced this time around. That is, I still had faith in myself. But perhaps the sort of standards for having that have gone up.
Can I just, there's a question which isn't about marriage per se, it's about relationships, but there's a question, how should your earlier relationships, whether they were marriages or any other sort of, how should you relate them to your current situation, whether it's a marriage or some other relationship? Should you, and the question is partly psychological, should you push those things away, ignore them, try to learn from them? Like what's the right, there was a woman who wrote, it was in the New York Times maybe a month ago, or a couple months ago. She wrote a letter to all of her exes before, on the occasion of getting married, I think for the first time, but she had a whole bunch of relationships before then. And it was her attempt to kind of not pretend that she hadn't gotten something out of those earlier relationships or that she hadn't had them. And so it was like not a love letter, but it was just sort of a letter acknowledging these things. I think it was a letter that she showed her husband. It was sort of like so she wanted it to be something that he also saw. And she thought it's very important not to, as it were, cut these things off, which is what people, I think, are often inclined to do, but rather just see them as part of who you are, part of your experience. But I think that's something people can, I think there's reasonable disagreement about that. That is, what should you make of, what should you do with these things once you're, maybe especially once you're getting married, anyway, that wasn't quite your question, but it was your question.
Yeah, but good, there is something there that I neglected, which is like, of course you think you've learned something from the first time around too, right? So you think you have, in some sense, better reason to have faith in yourself than you did last time around, because now you know some of the things that you didn't know then. And so you're making this decision on the basis of more information. So in effect, you might go at it two ways. One is that you need more faith, and the other is that you need less faith because you have more information. I guess I would fall on the more faith side of that, but Ben, what did you say?
Yeah, sure.
So I have a question regarding the previous point that you brought up about like the length of marriages and how this seems to be like a period where most divorces happen.
Yeah.
So, like bringing the example you gave with your high school boyfriend, the restaurant example. So do you think that the restaurant was actually a reason that that actually bothered you, or was it kind of this urge that you wanted to like break away the relationship, or you weren't completely convinced of the relationship, and you kind of tried to rationalize it in the restaurant? And to bring that to the marriage example, do you think it's just we have this maybe sometimes irrational need to kind of dissolve everything, and sometimes without doing that, 7 to 12 year period, you just stop fighting that urge, and you're like, okay, I'm going to dissolve it, and the people who are married longer are like, maybe it's going to get better. So do you think there's this assumption that when you actually do dissolve it, and like how true is it? When you actually do dissolve it, how do you know your happiness after divorce is better than your happiness if you had stayed in the relationship?
Good. I definitely think there's such a thing as people
try to dissolve or destroy or rethink or radically kind of like reimagine their lives on a regular basis, because I'm definitely one of those people. But I think that if you're one of those people, then you also tend to sort of partner with people who understand that and who can survive it, because it wouldn't be like 7 years, it'd be a lot shorter. There's a way in which divorce is still yet another level, like even if you're, you know, a person who like has a really hard time establishing, say, habits, right? Like, that's true of me. I actually have a really easy time. I just then break them again really quickly. But like with the restaurant case, it came to symbolize a kind of what I saw as unreasoned, self-stylized sort of like obstinacy, right? Where it was like he was sort of defining himself as a certain kind of person by way of like these extremely arbitrary choices about other things too. His car, his attire, like he always wore jeans, always. And we were high school debaters and you had to wear a suit, so he would wear jeans under his suit. And it was like, you know, and like, okay, when you first find that out, you're like, that's kind of cute or charming, whatever. And like, when it's like the 17th thing, where it's like, oh, you have to do it that way, and you just get like, so the point is like, all these things became He was a very weird person. You know, became connected in my mind into like a pattern, right? And then it's that point where you start to hate the person because you see the pattern as like who they are. I guess I think your basic question, which is like, how do you know which way is better? Like, you never get to live the other life in which you stayed married, and then like, you know, you compare that life, right? And so I think you just never know, really. You just guess.
But how do you justify divorce?
How do you justify anything? I mean, that's true of every choice, right? With every choice, you don't get to live the other life in which you made the other choice.
I think you can know that you should get divorced, even when you're not at all sure what the future holds, and even when you're not at all sure you'll be happier, at least in some sense of happier, you can still, and that's right, that you can know that, so to speak, this marriage is not right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think one way you can have that thought is you can sort of think to yourself, I can see myself becoming a bad person if I stay in this. Like, and then you're like, okay, that's not worth it, no matter what. Still kind of a prediction, but yeah.
To what extent do you think that marriage is setting us up for failure? I mean, there are a lot of redefinitions of marriage that you have brought today to the table, including the idea of love, which is relatively recent. There are a bunch of people and families and households that have been excluded traditionally from the definition of love. There are a bunch of ages that have been excluded historically because people didn't live until they were 80 or 100. So how do you think those standards of marriage we still aspire to are unreasonable or are setting us up for failure eventually?
I mean, one thing to say is that there are parts of the world where marriage is very much on the decline. Europe, especially, or parts of Europe, it's in precipitous decline. There are areas of Europe where people just don't get married, or it's an unusual thing. Maybe not geographic areas, but there are socioeconomic swaths of areas where it's actually unusual at this point. Though cohabitation is still common, but not marriage. And so, I mean, sorry, this is not to answer your question. It's just to say, like, one thing we can ask is that should we be happy about that? Unhappy? Should we take the decline of marriage as a? But sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm asking based on Professor Callard.
This one, yeah.
Professor Callard's idea that there are still a lot of people in this room that are thinking about getting married, right? And even in cohabitation, there's still a kind of a premise of like this long-term commitment, right? Where well, it might not be declared through a speech act, right? But there's no like end term to that contract, right? So yeah, I just want to understand whether those kinds of promises, right, are setting us up for failure, right, or are reasonable for the state of society that we live in and for the kind of people that we are.
So maybe one framework for thinking about this question is, how much is philosophy setting us up for failure? And the answer is like a whole lot, right? Because philosophical questions like about, say, free will or what kinds of things we can know, knowledge of the external world, what is courage, like those questions are so hard, and as we start to think about them, we start to realize all the ways in which we're like not getting to the bottom of something, right? And it's like, if you sort of commit to that, I mean, Socrates thought, it's fine because your soul's immortal, so you can just keep going, you know, forever, right? Another way to put what he thought is like, it's fine to just try to do what's impossible. Setting yourself up for failure is not such a bad thing. And so, like, you might think from that point of view, I think marriage does, in a certain way, the norms of marriage are like, it's sort of like, we know that a lot of us are going to fail at it. In the sense that a lot of our marriages will end in divorce. I'm not sure, though, that, like, so one thought that I had, one of my other questions, but I think we shouldn't go back. These are better questions than what I had. One of my other questions was about like a different model of marriage where it's like 5-year contract marriage, right? Where so you don't like promise to stay married. You just are like, for 5 years, let's stay together, then we'll reevaluate, right? And you could have like, it would be like, like a work contract where you re-up or something, right? So it's like, what if we had 5-year contract marriage instead of what we have? It would raise some problems for child rearing, I think, right? Of course, not like those problems aren't also raised by divorces. But I think you might think that, like, say you had a 5-year contract marriage, and say at the end of the 5 years you decided not to renew, okay? And you might be both a little bit upset and hurt by that, right? And let's say instead of that you'd had the 5-year marriage but gotten divorced after 5 years. It's just not obvious to me that the first one's better than the second, right? Like, you might think, yeah, it was better to fail at something bigger than to go for the smaller thing and succeed at it. And in fact, maybe in a lot of ways, I think we don't see our marriage as a failure. Like, we're not like sad that we got married, right? And you could think that there are ways in which a marriage succeeds, that the most important ways in which a marriage might succeed, like, can't be measured totally in its duration, right? That's part of why I raised the point about, like, if we were to live 150 years, it's sort of like maybe we're artificially inflating these marriages where people die before they get divorced, right? And, like, you know, we should be thinking about, like, the kind of joy and happiness and companionship and kind of cooperation that was possible in the marriage. And even if it's still a failure if it doesn't last longer, right? By the standards that we've set, but it may be that it would be a deeper failure if we didn't have those standards. Like, it's good to be able to fail in those ways.
Can I add on to that? So, there's a very, very abstract question, which is sort of like in the theory of normativity as such, which is like, when does something count as a failure? We certainly intended to, like, stay together, and that intention was not satisfied. Is anything that fits that description a failure in some normatively interesting sense? Part of why I'm asking is that I think that, quite apart from all the other things that go along with marriage, you know, the children case and stuff, I think that's sort of the official view, is that the answer to that question is yes, it is a failure. And I remember when we were getting divorced, like, you have to go through this whole thing, you know, you have to be in front of a judge, and the judge, I forget exactly, I blotted all this out, but, you know, they'd say, have you, like, tried really, really hard, or is there an irretrievable breakdown? And I remember both of us thinking, first of all, how's this any of your business? And second of all, you wouldn't want us to try if you knew what, you know, that is, but there's a thought that I think it's a very, in a way, a very abstract thought. It's sort of like, it's too bad. Like there was this thing and you were trying to do it and it's broken and it's failing and it's bad to fail and so it's bad and so we should try to make sure that we see if we can try to save it. And I'm worried that that's a kind of fallacy, that it's, we have an overly formal conception of what failure is. I mean, I don't know what, I was going to ask Agnes this, but I'll just throw it out to the group. Like, is divorce a failure per se in some interesting sense normally? That's my question. Or is it, I mean, it can be a failure substantively depending on what happens, maybe. But is any case where you set out to do something and then you don't succeed a failure? That can sound trivially, yes. I mean, failure is the opposite of success. But anyway, I'm not putting this too clearly. But
let me say one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
It's the failure in the promise, right? Going back to the definition of the promise, where I think that's where like the point of the failure would be, because it would also be a moral failure, right, and not living up to your promise.
Right. And so, but like, I think it is analogous to the philosophy case, because I think the point is like, you've got to commit yourself to finding the answers to these questions. Like, it's not good enough for you to be like curious or something. Like, you got to really be like, no, we're going to figure out courage, right? We're actually going to do it. And then, like, and then you can fail pretty spectacularly. So, and so I think you're right that like, you do commit yourself to something. And I even think that committing yourself to that thing, at least in most cases, is part of what makes the thing work or be good, right? But then it opens you to this distinctive form of bad thing. But, so what I wanted to say is like, that's also just life in the sense that, like, people die. And so the people you love die. And that's a big failure case, right? In that you like have built your life around them and now they're not there anymore. And that's like a vulnerability of every single one of your relationships. And of course, it's not a commitment. It's not quite the same, right? But it is a distinctive kind of failure where you're open to psychological trauma as a result of like a bond that you formed that can be broken by the world, right? And so I guess I just think more generally, like, we shouldn't always be avoiding those sorts of failures. And we should be okay with setting ourselves up for like failures. Yeah, Max.
So I was wondering, I was wondering, there was this problem with the promise in that like, it's not just a question of like hurting the other person's feelings. Like there's the question of like whether it's an ethical or like actually in the definition of the promise, it's not possible to undo it in some way. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, and your definition of marriage was that it's a romantic union bound by commitment, right? But then in what you said, what's good about marriage seems to actually have nothing, as far as I can tell, to do directly with commitment. And what I'm wondering is like, can you just do away with this problem? I'm not like, so what is good about marriage insofar as it is marriage? In other words, like, do you actually need the commitment, or do you need just some kind of understanding in the same way that I have a relationship to everyone who's alive as alive but not permanently alive? I can have a relationship to the person I'm with romantically that's defined not by its like permanence but by its like presence. Is that like, good. Is there anything good, like necessarily good?
Yeah, so let me say how I think the commitment thing fits in.
Yeah.
I think that if you're gonna do something by yourself, in general, you don't need to follow rules. You can kind of do it however you feel like. So, like if you're gonna eat lunch, you don't necessarily, by yourself, you don't necessarily just need to decide ahead of time what time are you gonna eat lunch, right? And you might just like decide at a certain time you're gonna eat it and then just decide like, go to the food trucks and just pick whichever one you want and eat it wherever you want, right? All those things, you can just like do it however you want. But now suppose you're gonna have lunch with someone else. Then you need to coordinate, right? And so you need to be like, let's meet at noon and let's go to this food truck and then let's eat here, right? And there, like, coordination is sort of like agreeing to be bound by a set of rules such that you, like, it's not an accident that you're doing something together, right? And so I guess that's where I see the commitment as figuring, where all those things that you're doing together, right? Like conversation and financial matters and whatever, you're sort of like, it's not like when you walk by someone on the street, a stranger, and you happen to be walking in exactly the same path together, right? Where that could be like, you know, accidental. It's like, no, you're making sure that you do it together.
And that's a cross-temporal fact too. It's sort of like you need to be now ensuring that you will be able to do it together in the future, so that like you know that if you, like me, if you're too dictatorial about like lunch times and like changing them all the time, then your spouse is gonna like not want to have lunch with you anymore. And so you have to be like, okay, I'm gonna just, even though I'm like not hungry yet, I'll have lunch. Where that's partly for the sake of future coordination. So I see commitment as connected to rule governance, and that as being a solution to a coordination problem.
Can I say anything about that? And I think I'm, in effect, disagreeing with you here, and I'm maybe more worried about the thought behind your question. Yeah. That is, but I would have thought that, there certainly is a coordination problem in a sense, but I would have thought that love solves the coordination problem per se, right? That is, if two people love each other, it's going to sort of, as it were, follow. What's to coordinate? You're right, and especially
appetites?
when.
Like sometimes one person. This is a problem I have all the time. What if one person's hungry and the other person's not hungry, but you're going to have lunch together? Right? And it's like, well, how long do you wait? Right? Love doesn't solve that one for you.
Good. So maybe love doesn't solve that one, but I thought the kind of commitment in question was the
spending your whole life.
Right, spending your whole life. And there it seems to be, so to speak, the following speech act would be a funny speech act. I love you, but I'm going to go now. I'm going to, we're not going to spend the rest of our lives together. You might have thought that first thought takes care of the second thought in a way that doesn't require a separate commitment, let alone the kind of public promise making that we do. So why do we need?
What about Casablanca?
Casablanca?
Reputation.
Wait, say what?
Well, I love you, but I'm going to let you go. And I'm going to let you go because I love you.
Okay, good, but that's a tragic case, right? That is, suppose setting aside cases where you've got
shows that love doesn't entail commitment.
But wouldn't the argument have to be then that in that case, like staying together is not the best thing? Like if it's true that love doesn't entail commitment, like surely when you say I do and like you make the promise, it's because you're kind of like you're saying explicitly something which is hard to say just through saying I love you, which is exactly what you were just saying, namely that me loving you entails staying together with you. But promising it is something which seems like you're explicating a certain part of it, which is like important and surface level in some sense, right? So then if I actually no longer, or maybe if I love you in some way that involves not staying together, that actually is more important than staying together. There's what's good about staying together then, right? Like.
Yeah, so I think I'm just like not quite following in that. Is your thought that I love you entails something like I will do whatever is good, where that could be a matter of staying with you, or it could be a matter of not?
No, I think the Casablanca case is kind of like I don't know. I can't really imagine. That's not really how I meant it. So maybe that could be an issue. I don't have that perfectly.
Yeah, it's a fair point that like my account of marriage seems to leave love out. I think that's a fair objection to it. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Does romance create volatility in a relationship and therefore is a worse kind of long-term relationship?
So you can mean like some different things by romance, right? So one thing you could mean is like, are people prone to sort of like romantic gestures and kind of like romantic activities, right? And another thing you could mean is kind of like strong, passionate emotion.
Strong, passionate emotion.
Okay. I think that's a really hard question. I think people really differ as to how much their emotional life tracks sort of like what makes sense. Let me give an illustration of this. Through this summer, I became obsessed with Ingmar Bergman, and I watched like a ton of his movies and like changed my life. And that's why we're doing Bergman the next Night Owls. But anyway, the thing I realized that really spoke to me in Bergman was that there would be these super emotional exchanges over what seems totally trivial. And then there would be these like things where something what you would think would be really, really emotional was happening, but people like a divorce or something where people didn't have any emotion at all. And like the emotions were like out of place in terms of like, and that made so much sense to me. And I'm like, oh, that's what I'm like. So I was like, finally, someone who gets me. So the point is, if you're like, for some people, their emotions are like really, really track what makes sense, right? And there I could sort of see, so whether or not emotions are going to like romantic emotions are going to make the marriage work or not, it's going to depend a lot on like what the emotions are tracking, right? And what they're connected to. And it's also going to depend on like how important someone's emotional life is to that person, right? So like someone might have a lot of strong emotions but feel like, yeah, but that's just something that I undergo and it's not like a really big part of my life and this other thing is really part of my life. So I feel like there's so many variables there in terms of the role emotion plays in your life, in terms of whether you feel like it is predictable or something or tracks what makes sense to other people, that it's like, I guess maybe I'll say one. I think there's like a little bit of it that has to be passionate. There has to be something like a possibility of anger, I guess I would say, and like something like that somewhere in there. But just because that's so fundamental to like how we feel importance. If nothing the person did, nothing they did could ever make you angry, it would be hard to like see yourself as being in love, I would think. But your thoughts about that?
But I take that that doesn't necessarily entail volatility in the sense that maybe you had in mind. Maybe it does. I'm not sure, but.
I mean,
yeah.
like a friendship, there isn't this element of romance, and so maybe it's more stable long term. Or thinking with your siblings, like you love them, but not in a romantic way, and therefore there's a different kind of quality to a romantic relationship that makes you want to marry a person, but also might, by the fact of being a kind of romantic relationship, make it the kind of relationship that is more volatile than the love that you would find for a friend or for a sibling, that makes it not conducive to a long-term relationship as that other love does.
Good. So I think that's true, but there's a flip side, which is that same emotionalness also sticks people together a bit, where like friendships can kind of just dissolve almost without people noticing them, right? Yeah. And like one thing about romantic relationships is that it's extremely rare that they would dissolve without people noticing it, right? And so like I think that volatility is the flip side of like being glued together in a certain way at a psychological level.
Yeah.
So I feel like you guys have been working under the assumption of monogamous marriage for the whole time. However, obviously there's a lot of cultures in the world where it's normal to have multiple spouses. How does polygamy does that fall under the definition of marriage that you guys are working under? And if so, how does it complicate the picture of marriage and divorce that you're talking about?
Yeah, good. That was one of my questions too. Why should people, what is to be said in favor of being married to only one person, if anything? I mean, it's the same point about, in a way, sexual exclusivity, I think, again.
I think there's a sort of boring question, which is, should we count it as marriage, right? Or like a polygamous marriage as a marriage? That's largely a question of nomenclature. And then there's a kind of substantive question, which is, what are the possibilities for a polygamous situation? That is, what kinds of relationships can you have with each of the people? That's not a terminological question. And there I take it that's going to be a function of I mean, we'd have to do an investigation of like the psychology and social factors, and some of those might be hard and fast, and some of them might be changeable. But but so the first question for me is less interesting, sort of like, do we want to call that marriage? And then there's the question, so to speak, could that be a good thing? Could it be good in the ways that are analogous to monogamous marriages? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that about the substantive question?
I guess I'm inclined to just think, yes, it could be good, in kind of pretty much all the ways that monogamous marriages are, but that it's like trickier, and that a whole bunch of social structures would have to be in place to make it work, right? Especially because if you're thinking about like both men and women having multiple spouses, like it gets very complicated very quickly, right? Because then some of those people could be married to each other, right? So like if you're imagining this on a large scale, it just becomes like really hard to think through the form of social organization that you have, right? And it makes you see why, like monogamous marriage creates like these kind of units, right? And even if you just had like, only men can have multiple wives, that would still create the units, right? But that's obviously sexist. And so then you're like, okay, that's not good. So you have to allow the women to have multiple husbands too. And then once you make that move, it just radically changes the sort of structure of the whole group, right? The group dynamic. And it means that like everyone's relationship to everyone else is sort of like indeterminate. It reminds me kind of like, well, maybe like a commune or maybe something like Plato's Republic, right? Where sort of like there aren't, like in a way, no one is married to any other specific person and no one is sure which two people are their parents, right? I guess I think like one could imagine that working, but it requires a lot of steps of imagination that a lot of things about our culture would have to change. So that it's like, it's hard to imagine, I guess.
I guess I'm also, I'm a bit of a skeptic here. That is, I'm not sure that any amount of those sorts of changes would there may just be some hard limits here. I mean, take friendship as opposed to romantic love. There's the question, sort of, what does it take to have a friend, or what you know? And I've had people who insisted that their Facebook friends were all their friends, you know, really their friends. And I think, no, you can use the word friend there, and there's some relationship that you have with these people, but you can't be friends with that many people. It's just, it's impossible. If you push me on it and say, well, what kind of impossibility is that? Is that, you know, psychological impossibility? Is it, what's, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but it seems to me there may be just some, and in the case of, obviously you can have more than one friend. Now we have the question of, you know, monogamy versus polygamy. Can you have more than one person who you stand in that sort of relationship with, that is romantic relationship? I don't know, but I guess it's not, for me that would be an open question. I'm not convinced that you can.
I mean, it is interesting how deep this idea of excluding others from the partner runs in a lot of people, right? So a lot of people sort of think part of what it is to like have a romantic partner is being able to say they're not allowed to have any other romantic partners besides me, right? So that's almost like a kind of ownership you have, right? And so the question is like, is it just that some people have that and other people don't have that kind of idea of the ownership? Or is it that certain cultural facts can make the desirability of that form of ownership seem really, really appealing to you? Like if you think about how at a certain point in the history of this country, like owning land was just like a really big, a really important deal, and like owning your house. And people now like tend to identify their property more in terms of like their career, because people move around more and like who they are is tied maybe more to their career than like their house, right? So that would be like a change in the way of thinking about like property and what it is to be me and where my status resides, right? And so like, could there be a corresponding change with respect to sexual exclusivity where somehow that would just seem way less important to people? And I guess I'm inclined to think yes. I could sort of imagine it. But it might also be a psychological fact that it would be like a lot more difficult for some people than others.
Sorry, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
It's hard to know, again, how to approach this. That is it psychology or metaphysics or ethics? Like, what's the right way to think about this? But, you know, so Aristophanes has the myth of, you know, people are looking for their other half in some literal sense, right? They're looking for there was a single being there and got ripped in two, and and you're trying to find, you're trying to complete yourself in some sense. And who you're attracted to is just a function of what the other side looked like. That thought, which again, I mean, it's a kind of a myth, but and so we have to decide how seriously or how literally to take it. But I think a lot of traditions have leaned pretty hard on something like that thought. I went and looked up, some of this stuff before coming here, and in both the Christian and Jewish traditions, for example, there's talk of like a person being incomplete until they're married, and it sounds very Aristophanic. There's a complete. If you think anything like that has any real is true in any interesting sense, then you might take those facts, whatever they are, to dictate the answer to the question about polygamy versus monogamy. That is, can you have three? Aristophanes imagines it like this. What it could be three parts. But anyway, if you take love to be at least illuminated by the thought that you're looking for your other half, that might affect the question: can polygamy sort of be a good or a real relationship? What?
I feel the obligation to give Socrates' comment on that story, which is, love is not of the half or of a whole, but of the beautiful. I've always been deeply suspicious of that story. I agree with Socrates. But, yeah.
I have a question. Since we're talking about marriage is kind of like a semi-rational process, but since I study economics and I believe that people are still more or less motivated by these external factors that affect their decisions, then maybe saying that like if you get married, you have to get married your whole life would be too extreme. Would it be a prudent idea to, for example, impose some cost upon your divorce so that at least you discourage your divorce? Wouldn't that be the rational, logical choice? Since when you get married, you at least to a certain extent rationally decide, or at least wish that you two could like go on forever. Then in that case, wouldn't you want to like nudge your decision that way a little bit? Say like, for example, if you get divorced, you lose half of your property to the government or something. Like if you voluntarily make this decision, wouldn't this make your marriage a more reliable thing? That at least it's more proof from these irrational changes in your sentiments or something that you can maybe get over in a short period of time.
Great. I'm really glad you asked that. Actually, I had a really similar question about, so I read about these two economists that sort of did this, but throughout their marriage, not just with respect to divorce. So like they just monetized everything in their marriage. So like you do the dishes, you get $10 or whatever. You do this, so it's like everything becomes a kind of monetary exchange. And then of course you're just asking about like a limit case, right? Where it's like just the divorce, monetizing just the divorce part of it. And so like one, I think really interesting question is like a lot of people find that absurd to do that. Why do they find it absurd? And I'm going to let Ben say something about that. But before that, I just wanted to tell you a really interesting sort of like economic fact about marriage that emerged like through no-fault divorce, which is that in effect, no-fault divorce incentivizes the person who wants to stay in the marriage to be nicer to the other person, right? And so, the kinds of divorces that happen are actually going to be shaped by questions like, and not only that, but the way people treat one another in marriage is then going to be shaped by like the nature of divorce, right? And so if you, in effect, this is a good thing about no-fault divorces are really good for the victim in the marriage, and they're a way to incentivize the perpetrator or whatever to make the marriage better. But I'll let you say something about the economizing your marriage, monetizing.
Do I have something to say about that?
Do you? I have stuff to say about it.
Okay. I do have a question. So were you imagining this as the state incentivizing, or
no, I'm saying like why wouldn't it be rational for people to like voluntarily choose this agreement before that? Like when people sign contract, they want it to go on, right? So they say that if you like fail this contract, you have to pay a certain penalty. I mean, in marriage, it doesn't necessarily have to be monetized. It could be like some other costs you have to bear. Like for example, if like you get divorced somehow and you need to like bear some other responsibilities or stuff. But I mean, like, wouldn't it be rational for people to voluntarily make this agreement or something like that?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like tying themselves to the mast, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Though we don't usually tie ourselves to the mast, so to speak, right? That is, normally when we make promises, we just make the promise. So we don't normally say, I promise this, and let me now add some like enforcement mechanism, some carrot or some stick, and I think that's not an accident. But you're thinking of some cases where we do that. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that is really the question is really about whether the fundamental mechanism of marriage is trust or whether it's some kind of self-interest, right? Rational and enlightened self-interest. Because you could, of course, do the same thing to promise making in general, right? So you could, instead of, like, every time your friend made you a promise, you could create an arrangement where they're going to suffer a certain penalty if they don't keep the promise, right? Like, pay me $50 if you don't keep this promise. And instead, instead of that, we have trust. So trust is, like, in place of that. And so then, and in a way, your question goes back to, like, our first question about, like, are we just irrational, right? Is it just irrational to trust people and to believe in a way that outstrips the evidence and to form these commitments but then not create an enforcement mechanism for them? And I guess my feeling is that when we feel that there's something weird about the economist couple who monetizes, and it wouldn't, again, have to be money, it could be other forms of punishment or payment, right? Who monetizes their marriage in that way, I think that my own feeling is that, yes, there is something weird about it. Not necessarily that it's wrong. My sense is that actually probably they're not really even doing it. I'm suspicious. Like, I think, so in the text that I was reading about this, it was clearly like, oh, we think we have all these trust relationships, but in fact there are like bashful markets hiding behind a lot of human interactions, right? So there are economic analyses, like Becker's famous economic analysis of marriage, right? There are economic analyses of marriage, and you might think, oh, well, something like that kind of monetizing is going on in all marriages, but it's being hidden, and these people are making it explicit. I suspect it's the other way around. Like, they're pretending to monetize their marriage, but, like, what does that actually mean? You have $50? Like, if we have the same bank account, or, you know? Like, I'm just not sure, like, at the end of the day, like, if there was a crisis, I mean, even if you had separate funds, if there was a crisis, wouldn't they, like, work together? And I think it's just that the idea of a market exchange is not the same thing as the idea of collaborating or working together, where, like, in a market exchange, the two parties fundamentally define their interests separately from one another. And they think that they both benefit from the exchange. But the idea of a marriage is that in some way you have like a shared interest. Having that, being in that position is a kind of vulnerable position in that you're seeing the other person as like included in your self-interest, and they could sort of defect and then screw you over, right? And that's similarly true about belief. Like, if you believe in a way that outstrips the evidence, then, to think about it from a Bayesian point of view, like, you can be Dutch booked, you can be deceived, right? You can be milked out of value if your beliefs are not formed using a certain standard set of mechanisms, right? So you're making yourself vulnerable in that way. But there's an advantage to making yourself vulnerable in that way, in that it allows for certain forms of collaboration, deep collaboration with other people. So I guess I think, sort of much like a prenuptial agreement, that sort of agreement would be a way of saying that I don't really trust the person.
By the way, speaking of enforcement mechanisms, so one question that I wanted to raise tonight and get an answer to, hopefully, is why do we have weddings? Right? We said earlier that we had a lousy wedding. That's, I think, fairly common. But set aside the lousiness of it, what's the point of the wedding? One theory of weddings would be that they function in effect as an enforcement mechanism. That is, making promises in private is one thing, but if you have to say it in front of a whole bunch of people, so to speak, now everybody knows that you've committed in these ways. I don't know whether that's the right answer. It's a kind of cynical answer, but I mean, that is the standard answer, is it's a celebration or something, but I think that can't be quite right, or that can't be the whole story.
They are really fun for we've enjoyed ourselves at other people's weddings. So maybe it's fun for other people, just not for people getting married.
Yeah, but absolutely. So it is, among other things, like a big party and stuff. But a wedding is defined not in terms of the party, but in terms of witnesses. In effect, it's people are witnessing it. Yeah, right. And the question is, why do we do that? That is, we have various nested possibilities at this point. Earlier we were saying, why don't we just say we love each other and not make promises or commitments? Then we have promises and commitments, but they're in private. And then we have public, in a social or social context, and then we have legal, the legal side of marriage. But so why do we do that? Why do we have weddings? What's the?
No, I think that's a good point though. Like, I think I was too dismissive, because I actually now think it's true that we kind of do have some enforcement mechanisms. But maybe it's kind of important to us that the enforcement mechanisms themselves sort of rely on a little bit of trust, like the fact that we care about the point of view of the people that went to the wedding and stuff like that. But let's take a few more questions.
Yeah.
So how common is a good marriage? If a good marriage is not common, should we avoid marriage or do so very cautiously? Or might there be some reason to seek marriage even if a good marriage is uncommon?
Sorry. I think this goes to some earlier discussions about, prediction versus intention, and, knowing that marriages are going to, 40% of marriages end in divorce and so on. So it plugs into that. But I mean, take another case. Trying to write the great American novel, or trying to become an NBA basketball player. I take it that's extremely unlikely and rare for any given person. But I think you wouldn't say it's therefore irrational to pursue it. Or certainly, if everybody thought that, then we wouldn't have any great American novels and we wouldn't have any NBA players. So what? I mean, setting aside the case of marriage in particular, do you think that if a thing is rare, it's irrational to pursue it, or if it's unusual?
I don't, but I was curious to hear what you
Yeah, I don't think it's irrational. But
I think it's really hard to say whether it's common or rare, because it would be like saying how common is happiness, And it's like, well, what you'd have to do is live as each person to know, right? And so I think it's really, really hard to know. I think even, children in a family will often not know, is their parents' marriage a happy marriage or not? So I think the answer, there's a very deep indeterminacy. It's very, very hard to judge people's marriages. So I don't know the answer about how common they are. It may be that, it's a kind of threshold issue, so that, there's sort of a good enough marriage, and that you can get a lot of goods out of a marriage if your marriage is good enough. And so that should be our question, how often are marriages good enough that they provide the characteristic goods of marriage such that they're worth entering into? But see, even that's really hard. I think that's an empirical question, and what we would need to do is find what we take to be correlates, right, of a good marriage. So you might think self-reports about happiness, or you might think, income going up when they enter the marriage, or you might, who knows, right? Having children, but whatever, you'd have to find some things that you're going to take to be correlates of it, and then check for those things empirically. I guess that would be your best bet. Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit more about love, and how love may or may not be constitutive of the marriage bond, and the relationship of love to the pain of divorce, or you don't feel pain of divorce, I don't know, because you can get divorced, but you can't unlove the person you love, and also how that love might relate to the child because what they're seeing is what they assume to be a permanent relation based on love between their parents disintegrate, and that is also what they have to their parents. I think.
Good.
So yeah, I mean, sorry, there's several issues there. Again, I think we can't define marriage in terms of love, even in terms of love as the ambition or the aspiration of it, because again, in the old days, people got married where love, they got married. It was a practical relationship, at least largely. Again, we're on the verge of saying, well, how does that count as a marriage in some interesting sense? Maybe that's just a kind of practical partnership or something. But in any case, I don't think that love was taken to be a necessary condition, and we don't want to say, well, none of those things were marriages, before we started taking love that way. And then, of course, there are marriages now where just as a matter of fact there isn't love, but we still want to call those marriages. They're just bad marriages. So I certainly wouldn't want to make it into the definition. We still have this other option, which is taking it as the ideal, or taking it as constitutive of a good marriage. But do you want to speak to the second part of the question?
I just thought that was a really good point about children, that maybe part of what is so traumatic for a child is that they're creating a new universal principle, which is that love can die. And there's no reason for them not to apply that to the relationship between themselves and their parent. That's a really good analysis of what might be traumatic about divorce for children. So that's all. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, I think.
But I don't know. I think I might have something to say about love, but it's really hard for me to try to say it while looking directly at the problem. You know what I mean? It's one of those topics where you almost have to approach it from the side by thinking about something else, and then you found yourself talking about love and you said something good. And so if I'm just like, what's love? I once did give a talk about this. Actually, right when Ben and I got divorced, I'm like, okay, now's the time I'm going to explain what love is. And that, I felt very inspired then. And it felt like I knew it and understood it. But I think that now I could speak on the topic, but only by by trying to answer other questions and then landing there.
We overcalled. Yeah.
So we've talked about kind of the relation of love to marriage, but I'm kind of wondering about the relation of respect to marriage, mutual respect. Particularly with this idea of kind of arenas of cooperation. Is there any particular way we might think that mutual respect would play into that? And if not, is there any sort of relation between this idea of mutual respect and kind of this construct of marriage?
Yeah, how's respect related to trust? I guess one way that respect seems important is that it's kind of a counter pressure. I've been sort of saying, there's this cooperation and collaboration, but it is pretty important to see that the person you're married to is another person independent of you, even if you do share interests, right? And that's, I think that's where sort of respect figures, or at least one place where it figures, is that your interests may not, your desires or whatever may not always align, and that things about them that don't make them fully collaborative are still them, and that would be a part of it. That your sort of collaborations are not some kind of meld, but they're genuine collaborations of two, in some sense, still independent beings, and respect is part of that. It's part of the difference in a way.
The issue of two independent beings versus one, I was talking a minute ago about the Aristophanes case, and we talked earlier about, transport cases and so on. I take it that the thought of a marriage is often the thought of, many becoming one flesh, right? And so, but I also see your point, which is that we want there to be two people in a marriage, and I don't know whether to treat that as a paradox. It's like
it's the oldest problem in philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. How do you make a one out of a many, or how can a many be a one? Yeah. Gödel said that was the problem with set theory. It's like, yeah. How do we? What's the sense in which we want to have a one? Is I take it one of the central questions in the theory of marriage, so to speak. Do you have any brilliant ideas about that?
I guess I think it's got to be like a looser unity. Like if you think about like, I don't know, form and matter are two, but they're one. But like spouses are less one than that. It's pretty important that you're like still metaphysically independent beings. Like one of you can die and the other one doesn't die, right?
But we have some resources here. We could say two people are of one mind, meaning they, share values and so on. So,
right. But even like the idea, if I'm right, that there's something very important about sort of collaboration. That's essentially like an activity between two different things.
Yeah.
Right. Vrun.
All right, cool. So pushing the polygamy point a bit further, I'm just wondering, like, what is the point of marriage? And thinking about marriage maybe in terms of promises or explicit commitments, which seems like any definition of marriage would just include, like, what is the point of relationships built around explicit commitments to be certain kinds of people with each other? And so maybe to like stress out why I think it's not obvious that this is something good. So first, I think that there are lots of other rich relationships that we have, like friendships, that aren't necessarily based on explicit commitments, that actually capture a lot of the value of maybe something like a marriage. So say like an emotional type of connection, or even like a sexual connection, like there's certain kinds of friendships that can have these things. And then maybe you might say that like commitments are still valuable to have, but like commitments in relationships, and especially in marriages, are really strange to me. So take an example of trust, right? So it's like you make a commitment to trust your partner, and then you live up to that over the course of the relationship. In marriages, in friendships where I trust my friends, they've had to prove to me first that I can trust them, and then I trust them. Or maybe even in the case of parenting, it's not like you get into a marriage like knowing that this person is going to be a good parent. They kind of need to prove to you over the course of that marriage that they can be a good parent, right? Over like say another world where we go out explicitly trying to find people who would be like who we could be good parents with, and they would have to prove to us first that they could do that, right? And so there's a weird way in which the commitment comes first in marriage, and then people live up to that commitment. While it seems to me like other types of relationships where people have to prove that they can make those commitments first before they're explicit. And so that's like another point. And then I guess I don't know if that disagreement makes sense, and I can get into that a bit more. And then it's finally like we've talked about how in marriages. Like, if it can sometimes be overly demanding or too all-encompassing, or people can change over time, and so it just isn't obvious to me that, like, a relationship built around explicit commitments is even important to have. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so often the rationales given for marriage are not in terms of they're sort of, in some sense, practical or extrinsic to the, let's say, the bond that you have with the person. It's designed to create and raise children. It's an economic relation, right? So you can certainly appeal to those rationales, but you might take those rationale. You might think those are fine as far as they go, but they don't justify marriage in the way that you would want it justified. I think that I see what you're saying. I guess I'm maybe sympathetic to that thought. One, I mean, we've already been talking about what the role of the commitment is, even in a marriage. That is, it's taken to be definitional on a marriage, but you might think you can have a marriage where you just love the other person and express love to the other person, and that's it. There's a kind of I don't know whether it's, again, a psychological question or a sociological question. The way you're seeing it is there are these other options, right? There's friendships, friends with benefits, there's all these other things you can have, and then why have this other funny institution, right, where you make these funny promises and so on. And that may be the right way of thinking about it, but you might think that it can turn out that those other things are in fact parasitical on the existence of marriage or something like it in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And so to speak, we can't throw away marriage that easily because the other things are maybe in some sense defined on it. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm saying that's something we need to consider. Did you have a...
Yeah, I guess my thought is like all those other relationships also involve commitments, and they include often lots of different kinds of promises. And I don't think it's true that the person you marry doesn't, in some sense, have to prove themselves. Like, I mean, in some, like with arranged marriages, no, right? But you know, and I think some people do go out looking for someone who they think will be like a good parent. I think, but I guess I think that. So I think that I guess like commitment is certain kinds of commitments are parts of a lot of different relationships, and some amount of trial is available before marriage. But maybe why I think, like what I think is sort of important about the scale of the promise that's made, I mean, it's related to the question about setting us up for failure. I think it's important to set ourselves up for certain kinds of failures. Like, it may be that there are certain things that we can only achieve when we set ourselves up for certain kinds of failures, right? So it's sort of like marriage, like we make all kinds of promises to our friends and we consider ourselves bound, but like marriage is like a really big one. We make like a really, like, because it's sort of like you could be in a relationship and be like, well, let's not put a label on it, right? And then you'd be like, no, I want to put a label on it. What is it to put a label on it? It's sort of like to have a norm with respect to which that thing sort of like aspires to live up to, and it can now fail, right? And I do think that we exaggerate the sole importance of the temporal part of the norm, right? Like, it's not just a promise to like keep loving the person, but it's also a promise to like love them a lot, like at any given time, right? And so holding yourself up to that norm is like saying, like, you know, we're gonna aim big in this relationship, and we'll never have enough reason to know that we'll succeed. But I think that it wouldn't be better if we didn't try, even though it would be less painful if we didn't try. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely convinced, but this idea of it's important to have certain projects in our lives that set ourselves up for failure, it also seems important to have projects in our lives that set ourselves up for success, right? And so there needs to be some kind of like limit or like line between how far you want to push projects that set us up for failure and projects that don't, and so this, I mean, part of the tension in marriage is like a lot of people have terrible marriages, right? They'd be much better off with other sorts of relationships, and that could fulfill the same kind of needs that they get out of a marriage, but maybe in a richer way that doesn't involve like the kind of social commitment that ends up kind of binding them and doesn't allow for the kind of growth that they want to experience or so on. So it isn't obvious to me that like marriage, like if you take the point that it's important to have projects that set ourselves up for failure, that marriage is that kind of project.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I think that there are many of the people you describe don't get married because they understand that about themselves,
sure.
And they have these other sorts of relationships. Actually, one of the questions I was going to ask is like, what makes a person unsuitable for marriage? Sort of on the assumption that there is such a thing. I think we know such people. Who would totally admit that about themselves? Okay, so like that wouldn't be. They would be the first to admit it about themselves. So to say that like, look, it's kind of like Ben's point. It's like there should be the great American novel, which is not to say everyone should try to write it. And I think marriage has a broader appeal than that. But that doesn't mean that it's really important to set yourself up for that particular kind of failure. Like that is, it could be that that's not the kind of failure for you. Yeah.
On this sort of setting one up for failure issue, I think a lot of people, especially in the 20th century, and especially in the late 20th, early 21st century, have seen marriage as in some way unnatural, or it's a kind of an unnatural constraint. And there are obviously two ways to go if you accept that premise. One is to say, right, and it's always good to be natural, so much the worse for marriage. The other is to say, no, marriage is one of many things in human life which allows us to, in some sense, rise above nature, or to be aspirational in Agnes's sense, to kind of shoot for the stars. It's also going to open us up to failure. But the thought is that, and that fact gets sort of takes up a bunch of different features of the case. Like in an earlier question, there was the question about, like, you know, committing yourself to just sleeping with one person for the rest of your life. It might well be the case that in some sense sleeping around is the natural state. Then we have the ethical question, right? So should we try to bind ourselves not to do the thing that's natural in that sense? That is, that's our natural inclination, or not? And that's just an ethical question. But the point is that we have two options once we see it as an unnatural institution. You still look unconvinced.
Well, there's certain kinds of unnatural institutions that we reject, right? And
Sure.
we need to kind of make the decision between what kinds of unnatural institutions do we want and which ones do we don't. And I think the case can be made that marriage is an institution that we don't, right?
Sure.
Or not. So, like, that isn't entirely convincing because you still have to do some more work to argue that, like, this is an unnatural institution that we should, like, value.
Right, absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
So a lot of things we've touched on tonight, I think, are applicable not only to relationships of like a single generation in which like marriage occurs, such as ownership, child rearing, and they're not just within the realm of like the single unit of the parents, the spouses, and their children, but there's also like the generation before them. So what role do you think like adult parents of adult partners play in the decision to enter a marriage and to leave a marriage?
I think I don't quite get the question. So is your thought that, like, the fact that, like, you're, like, say, my parents and Ben's parents might be kind of models for us about...
They might be models. They might have ideas about the fact that you should stay together or not stay together.
I see.
Or yeah.
Yes, good, right. So it's sort of like we've been operating under the fiction that people make all their own decisions.
Yes.
Yeah, good. You're looking back at me and you're like, I guess I think that you're right that people quite often even feel like they can't fully on their own have a thought about whether or not this is like a good person without, like, it's really important to us that our parents approve or that our siblings too approve, right? Which is to say that getting married to someone in a way is like joining them to your life, to a bigger group, right? And so the people in that group then like are gonna in some way have a say. I guess I would say maybe that's a little bit less true than it used to be, but it's still true that your parents will have a say in terms of marriage. Will they have a say in terms of whether you get divorced or not? They will try to, I think. And I think divorce is particularly unpopular among parents, that is, right? Because it's sort of like the point of view they have is just like, it's just a destruction of something. And one of my questions that I was going to ask Ben was like, what is the role of courage in marriage or divorce? And I think that one of the places where that shows up is that both getting married and getting divorced sometimes involve renegotiating your relationships with other people. And one way to do that is to break off contact, right? But that's usually like a bad way, and or often anyway, a bad way. Like it may be a last resort, right? In some way, even if it's not a matter of your relatives having a say, it's still going to be a matter of renegotiating that relationship and sort of having the courage to do that. So I guess I think regardless of sort of like how much say they get, there is that kind of a way in which both marriages and divorces are kind of like destabilizing with respect to other relationships. It's true.
I think this came out a little bit, but it isn't just parents. Obviously, it's a whole network
friends.
of people. Yeah. So like, and sorry, I think Agnes is right that divorce often takes a certain kind of courage. But in addition to the things that you expect will happen and where you're courageous relative to those expectations, there's a whole bunch of unforeseen things that happen. So for example, a lot of our friends were just really, really unhappy with us, and it damaged a bunch of friendships and ended a few of them, and it
That was really surprising.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the most surprising thing about getting divorced, was how
Yeah.
upset our friends were.
Yeah.
More so than our families.
Yeah. But there obviously it isn't a matter of, it's not so to speak that they're having sometimes they might have a say in it in advance of it's happening, but in any event, some of it is going to be pressure not to do it, and the other is going to be just unhappy or shocked reactions to it. I think in a way this goes back to your question about social construction. That is, in the old days, the will of the parents was very much a constitutive part of the marriage, and then that's just slowly waned, at least in many places.
Solve the issues with the divorce. So a lot of the times when the couple does not have any children but they want to get divorced, people will suggest for them to have children because maybe that'll mend the relationship. What are your thoughts?
One interesting statistic I read, and just like reading up before this, was that the fact that there are now no-fault divorces, it's like easier to get divorced, and the fact that people postpone childbearing more than they used to means that children are less affected by divorces than they used to be, because a lot of divorces happen before the people have any children. So I just found that interesting. Interesting cultural shift. I mean, we already had children by the time we got divorced, so I guess it's a bit incredible to me that having children would like improve the kinds of problems with a marriage that would lead you to think of getting a divorce, which isn't to say that couldn't happen, but children are a huge stressor on a marriage. It's like all of a sudden you care not about as much about each other, but like a third thing, right? And so, like, I suppose the logic would be, well, yeah, but maybe you didn't have anything in common and now you do, right? I'm sure it's happened, but I guess it sort of like doesn't correspond to my experience that would be like a major way to save a marriage. Like, I'm sure it could happen, but it's just sort of like not something where I've encountered some phenomenon where I'm like, oh yeah, I see that.
I share Agnes's intuitions about that, about how having children will repair problems in a relationship. Needless to say, again, if there's a traditional conception of marriage on which it's primarily about having children and not primarily about in that sense, the health of the relationship. And
right.
So, having children would absolutely solve the problems. If that's the goal of the marriage. But
Stephen.
So do you think ceasing to love your partner is sufficient reason for divorcing? I ask this because, like, for a romantic relationship, ceasing to love your partner seems to be a sufficient reason for ending the relationship. But is that the case for marriage? I mean, partly we don't do that. We don't end marriage just because we're seeking to love our partner because, like, practical reasons, like kids, financial matters. But supposing a no-fault relationship and you don't have attachment with kids, do you think that's a sufficient reason for divorcing? Or is it marriage such a different project that it requires more effort for you to try to fix that?
Yeah, good. That's a great question. So we'll put it this way. Suppose there were no like kids or financial reason to stay together. And suppose that you realize that you don't love each other. Is just the fact that you've committed a reason to stay married? Or like, is there some reason to stay married?
Or trying to fix it.
Or to try to fix it, yeah. Well, trying to fix it, I think, like, if what you think is that you could love each other again, right? Then it's easier to say yes. But with the hard cases, like, it's sort of like, what is the commitment even about if it has no weight? I think that's what's sort of really compelling about your question is, like, suppose that all there is the promise, right? You made a promise to stay together. Now, you're in a situation where you have no other reason to stay together, but you do still have the promise. Does the promise constitute any kind of reason, right? And it's like, if it doesn't, then it wasn't a promise. If it constitutes no kind of reason on its own to stay together. And yet I'm sort of inclined to be like, yeah, it doesn't constitute much of a reason at that point. So, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean,
that's a very powerful argument.
Yeah, no, I agree. I wouldn't put it in terms of it's not a promise. I would put it in terms of this shows what promises are. I mean, that is...
If the promise provides you with no reason, you're saying the promise could provide you with no reason at all to fulfill it? The fact of having promised? Isn't that what promising is? That the fact of having promised provides you with some reason to fulfill the promise?
That's the point of promises. But if you say in the right context, I hereby promise X, I think maybe we're not disagreeing. I agree that when you make a promise, you do therefore have these reasons, and then we have this puzzle, which is, but my point is that there is a question which came up right at the beginning of this of our conversation tonight about what is the sort of the force of promises, not just marital promises, but any promises. Like how do they work? Can you undo the normative structure that you create by making a promise? I'm not sure we're disagreeing substantively. Your thought is you want to say it ain't a promise if it doesn't have
if the promise itself doesn't carry any weight, I think we have to reevaluate everything we've said. Start over. Really. I mean, does everyone see the problem? It's a big problem, right? Our whole analysis of marriage was that marriage is a commitment, right? Where the idea is that you're bound because you made a certain agreement. But now, like, Stephen has produced what we could put in the form of an argument, right? But look, if all that were remaining in the marriage were the commitment, you wouldn't want to save the marriage just to save the commitment, but that's just to say that there isn't really a commitment. Lucy, did you have a thought about this?
I'm not sure if this is just like a question of home law, but I was thinking about like if we think about like social contract theorists and the way they think about like getting into certain institutions, like provides the conditions under which you can like act in a certain way that you want to act, but you can't act like prior to being institutions, and then also that like promising something is a way of thinking forward to, like, there are cases under which, like, I mean, I think that getting out of this situation is a bad thing, but, like, I might be wrong in that situation, and so I'm gonna, like, put less weight on, like, how I feel right now than, sorry, those two things seem more connected.
Good. Well, I'm actually I'm starting to see a potential way out of Stephen's problem. I found it helpful to think about, like, what you were just saying, where you're saying that there are sort of circumstances under which I'm making a promise, and I have reasons for making it. I forgot that part. That when we make promises, we make them for reasons, right? And we ask people to promise things for reasons, right? There are goods that are secure. It's sort of like, will you pick me up from the airport? Yes. And it's like, yeah, but like, that's embedded in a context of like, it's good to be brought home from the airport. Like, so suppose that like, it turned out I was just going to take another flight right afterwards. Like, you shouldn't pick me up then. Like, in a way, even if you promise, because I just got to get on another plane, right? So it may be that, that it makes sense, say, for two people to release one another from a promise, right? Under certain circumstances. Circumstances that speak to the reasons that grounded the promise in the first place, right? They didn't make the promise for no reason at all. They made the promise for reasons. And like the fact that it's a promise means that it isn't as though when those reasons go away, the promise just goes away, right? But that there is this possibility of releasing one another from the promise. And you might think, yeah, in a given case, it might make more sense to release one another from the promise than to fulfill the promise. But that wouldn't show that there was no promise.
The once we're grounding it that much in the reasons for the promise, why do we need the release part? Why can't we just have the dissipation of the reasons part?
I guess because so I think this is sort of like connected to the thing Lucy was saying, which is that, like, in a sense, promising is sort of having things not directly and immediately track your reasons. Like if you sort of, in a way, feel like you can't always trust your immediate reaction or something like that, right? So you're sort of binding yourself to some degree, but that binding itself has some kind of ground, right? It's not just like out of nowhere. And so it can then be, in a certain way, assessed and then cooperatively changed, right? But not maybe not unilaterally. Yeah.
Just continue about the questions about promise agreement. So I don't really think the agreement is the same as promise. That's the first point. And the second point is that I do think when we are making a promise, it's more about making an agreement and the so-called like metaphysical promise in which it's impossible for you to release yourself from that promise. Do you think it's possible for human beings to make such a perfect promise? Or when we make promise, it's actually more about making agreement. And agreement is something like, so we are very used to see the agreement in which if we break the agreement, we will experience some loss. For example, if you break the contract, maybe you have to pay a penalty. We have to talk about that. But like when we make a promise, especially when it's promise about marriage, such that like when you divorce, you may not really experience some penalty, but actually when you say I promise something, there is a kind of penalty, like mental penalty, in which if you break the promise, you yourself will feel not good. So that's the kind of penalty in the agreement. But indeed, for human beings, I think it's not possible for us to make the perfect promise because we cannot control everything.
I'm inclined to think that we can, though again, maybe we shouldn't. But I think we have this amazing power. Though again, we want to keep separate the structure, the content of the promise and the ethics of whether you should keep the promise. Those are two different questions. So I think that when you, for example, promise to go to somebody's birthday party, you're not just saying, I'll try to be there. You're not saying, I'll be there unless something else comes up. I think it often has a categorical structure, a categorical content. But then if another friend has to go to the hospital, you should go take your friend and you should break your promise. So it's, I don't think, the fact that it has a categorical structure, I don't mean categorical in concepts. I don't think you're obligated to keep all of your promises. Or in any event, that's a separate question from the question, what's the content? And I'm inclined to think that the content is very, or at least it can be very sort of extreme and metaphysical in the way that you're. But you were saying before that you think that really we're talking about agreements, and you took that to be.
So
can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think if it's actually impossible for us to make such a perfect promise. For example, let's don't talk about one of your friend goes to the hospital and you have to look after him or her. What if you got the car accident on the way to your birthday party, on the way to your friend's birthday party? You cannot control it.
Right.
And in that way, you do not even have the capacity, should I say that?
Yeah.
You don't have the capacity to keep the promise.
Right.
But promise, if it's in a perfect way, is something you can't act out. So you must act out, but it's like sort of contradiction. So I think yeah, promise is more like something, so it's on a, maybe we can say on a higher level than agreement. So it's not a very simple agreement, but it's more than agreement in the sense that you are trying to accomplish that. And if you don't accomplish that, you may experience a kind of like moral loss.
Yeah.
But still, if something bigger than that moral loss happened there, it's still possible for you to release from the so-called promise, because indeed that's only an agreement. And you just have to experience, you just have to bear that habit.
So I think like in the theory of promises, people usually think that there's a clause about being prevented by external forces, right? So the idea is, insofar as it's up to me, I'm going to do such and such, right? Where that's contained or assumed in the promise that you're like insofar as it's up to you, you'll do this. And so if your thought is, yeah, we can't make promises without that clause in them, I think most theorists of promises would agree with you. We have time for like 2 more questions, I think. So if people have, yes.
I guess I'm just still very confused about one important thing, I guess.
Good.
So why do people get married at all? Because technically it's just a legal thing, right? It's just a stamp in the passport. Yes, it is a promise, but essentially it's just like you sign a paper and that's it. So why can people just like promise something to each other without having to go and sign something, or like to make it official and to legally bind themselves? Why do we even do this?
Yeah,
and
so
more specifically, why do we remarry if we got a divorce at some point?
yeah, so I mean, so there are different. There's the question, why do we have the legal institution of marriage? There's the question, why do we have marriage as a public thing, legal or otherwise? There's the question, why do we have promise making, even private promise making, as opposed to just being with the person? And we've already talked about those distinctions, and there are different kinds of reasons in play in each case. You might think that that there's a kind of even if we did away with legal marriage, and even if we did away with marriage as a public thing, where you have a wedding and so on, you might think that there's a kind of that we have, so when you love somebody, you have to register that fact. You have to register it to yourself, but you might think it's important that you, so to speak, acknowledge it, and acknowledge it with the other person. And then the question is, what shape or what form does that acknowledgement take? And you might think that a good way to take it is something that at least gets us in the direction of marriage commitments. So I mean, there's two. You could disagree with that in 2 different places, right? You could say you don't think that we have to have in a loving relationship. You don't have to have that kind of acknowledgement, or you could think you do have to have it, but it doesn't have to look anything like a marriage, even, so to speak, a private marriage, a private commitment. But yeah, what's your...
So let me give you another case that doesn't look anything like marriage, but I think that, so at the yoga studio that I go to, every once in a while there'll be like a 20-day challenge or something, right? Where it's like, or 30, you're gonna go 30 days in a row, or you're gonna go you're gonna go at least so many times per week or whatever. And people just sign up for these challenges, and you don't get anything if you succeed, right? But people seem to like them, and they seem to want to sign up for them. And it gives you something to shoot for, right? And it's public, and there's like a wall, and you put your name down, and you say which one you're going to do, right? Other people can look at it. And you could think of that as like one form of sort of like making use of like the benefit of society to bind yourself to a certain kind of goal, where that goal might be good for you and it might make you happy, but you might fall away from it due to other pressures. And so I guess that's how I would tend to see marriage, is like you could, in a way, you could do this all yourself, like as a couple, without society, without declaring anything, right? You could, I think. But you could also just decide I'm going to go to yoga every day for 30 days. But like a lot of us find that really hard. And like when your name is up on that board, you find it a little bit easier. So you might think of marriage as like mobilizing that, like the other people to help you fulfill a certain kind of goal.
So in reference to other people, I want to ask a question about a tweet that you posted. There's a reason he's alone.
Yeah. Well, here he is in real life. Yeah.
So relationships are like obviously an eminently social thing. There's such a thing as no-fault divorce. I can say you and I aren't compatible, we're going to get divorced. But the inverse isn't true for initiating a relationship. I can't go up to you and say, you and I are compatible, let's be in a relationship, because that's just not the way the world works. And so in reference to something you said earlier too, why is it, or are there people who aren't meant to be in marriages? Are there people, / why can't we be friends with our exes? Or why is the owl alone?
Yeah, that's a good one to end on. We can be friends with our exes. We're friends. But I think it's often hard. It's often hard to be. There's a lot of questions in there. I don't know, Ben, you want to start on one of them and I'll try to think about some of the others?
I actually don't know about this tweet.
Oh, it's just a picture of this owl, and it says, "Why is he alone?" Because it was like a reference to like night owls coming, but he's only one owl because he's a divorced owl. Was the idea? I think you were maybe one of the few people who got it because there was no reference to night owls in the tweet. It was just a photo of me holding this bird saying, "Why is he alone?" But that so look, the basic one question you ask is like, are there people who aren't meant to be married, or like for whom marriage isn't going to work out, right? And what would it be to be such a person? I take that to be one of the questions.
And we can distinguish, given how this person is, would it be? Is it better that they not get married or not? Maybe even not be in a relationship. From the question, is any of that ideal? Like, right? So it might be that I have friends who are just. They have enough hang-ups that they're definitely not, they shouldn't be with anybody. But, so to speak, they would be happier if they could be with somebody, so to speak, but we'd have to get rid of those hang-ups. But given that it happens, so we have different levels of assessment here. So you at least could think, so to speak, for everybody, the ideal is to find the person that they love, and but there's some, as it were, obstacles or hindrances to that for some people. Or you could think that's not the right way to think about it. That, so to speak, there's just different kinds of people.
Yeah, I guess at a basic level, I would think it's like, how collaborative are you on some level, right? And some of us are so collaborative that it will be very easy to find a romantic partner and have a fulfilling relationship. And then some people, it's like difficult because you're not that collaborative. And like in school, there's always like the people who that's easy, that's difficult, right? And then there just might be someone like at a really far extreme where they're really not collaborative, right? Where it's like really important to them to eat at certain times and sleep at certain times and make all these decisions exactly in the way they want to make them. And that's not compatible with living with someone else, basically. So I would say it's that. It has to do with like how much you feel like your life is enriched through collaboration. Yeah, we should stop. Sorry. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you. And hold on, one more thing. Just because he's now here, can we have a round of applause for William, who was like this?
I also want to add a round of applause for Andy Poulos, who has been filming this for
many hours.
So, a couple things I want to say is that if you can all help us out by pushing chairs to the edge of the room and stacking them, that will save us an hour. That'd be great. Also, one thing, we actually had about 350 or 400 people who showed up. A lot of people showed up in the hall late, so congratulations for getting into the room. If you email me, William Weaver, wweaver@uchicago, you can find me on the philosophy website. As soon as we get the film done, we'd be happy to send the film to you, send it to your parents, to your friends, to future spouse. Thank you very much for coming.